live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. But for today, it is only going to be Thomas. And so I'm going to say in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas. And you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, I am going to be running this on my own today. My indispensable co-host is not necessarily going to be here today. Nevertheless, we're still going to keep this boat rocking. Let's get to the headlines. In the news, COVID-19 infections are decreasing in the United States with 45,661 new infections reported on average each day. That is an 18% of the peak, the highest daily average reported on January 7th. There's been 32,676,728 infections, 580,336 coronavirus-related deaths reported in the country since the pandemic began, and this is reporting per Reuters. The COVID pandemic has taken nearly 6.9 million deaths across the world, more than double the number officially recorded. A new analysis from the University of Washington Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, HME, has estimated deaths go unreported as most countries only report those deaths that are in hospitals or of patients with confirmed coronavirus. The report shows the IHME is an independent health research organization that provides comparable measurements of the world's health problems and has been cited by the past by the White House and is reported and is watched closely by health officials. President Joe Biden on Wednesday threw his support behind waiving intellectual property rights for coronavirus vaccines, bowing to mounting pressure from Democratic lawmakers and more than 100 other countries, but angering pharmaceutical companies. The funny part about the angry pharmaceutical companies, well, it was unclear whether Joe Biden was going to do this, but Joe Biden did say he was going to do this before taking office. So the fact that he did it, good job. He gets applause for that. India on Friday reported a record daily rise in coronavirus deaths of 414,188, while deaths from COVID-19 swelled by 3,915, according to the health ministry data. India's coronavirus infections now stand at 21.49 million, whereas total fatalities have reached 234,083. The South Asian nation has added 1.57 million cases and just over 15,100 deaths a week, or I should say this week alone. Anthony Blinken, our Secretary of State, has visited the Ukraine. So Secretary of State Blinken spoke at a joint conference with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on Thursday. Blinken says the United States strongly backs Ukrainian sovereignty against, quote, Russian military aggression, saying, quote, Russia has pulled back some forces, but significant forces remain on the Ukraine's border. And so Russia has the capacity to fairly, on short notice, take aggressive actions if it so chooses. Blinken added that the United States was watching, quote, very, very carefully. I'm not sure what the U.S. would do, but they are watching. Blinken also warned that Ukraine was under threat from, quote, internal forces, unquote, including powerful oligarchs who thrive on corruption. For his part, President Zelensky effusively thanks Secretary of State for the visit. In news that rocked Atlanta's political realm, if we were going to call it that, first-term mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms announced on Twitter that she will not be seeking re-election. Quote, Derek is her husband, as Derek and I have given thoughtful prayers and consideration to the season before us, Mrs. Bottoms wrote an online letter. It is with deep emotion that I now hold my head high and choose not to seek another term as mayor. Atlanta, like many of the other cities, have had a spike in violent crime, but it's unclear whether that is a reason, even though that is something her opponents have seized on. And she mentions here, talking about the political season before her, that it's going to be a big shake to the political system in Atlanta, put it mildly. Per the New York Times, the United States and Iran could each come back into compliance in 2015 for the nuclear agreement within a week. Now, this is from a senior State Department official that was said on Thursday, on the eve of what could be a final round of negotiations before an agreement is brokered. Briefing journalists, the New York Times, briefing journalists on the conditions of anonymity, the senior official described the likelihood of an agreement before the Iran presidential elections in mid-June as both possible and doable. He did not rule out that it could come in a round of talks that begin to begin on Friday in Vienna. Now, this is the U.S. take, or this is secret anonymous sources from the United States is giving their take on this kind of conversation that's taking place behind the scenes. Press TV is giving somewhat of a different take, though. Press TV is basically making the point that this doesn't seem like something that is going to happen right here. Press TV comes out and says Iran won't accept nuclear demands. And I just read it. Press TV has learned that Iran will not accept the new demands put forward by the United States and the European Union in the course of the diplomatic process underway on the potential revival of the 2015 nuclear agreement. Press TV has learned on Thursday that the United States and the European signatories to the deal apparently want the destruction of Iran's new generation centrifuges in return for a temporary suspension of some of the sanctions related to the nuclear deal, officially titled the JCPOA. Basically, we're getting competing stories. From Press TV, the organization that works with Iran, they're saying this is a no-go. However, U.S. media is basically saying this is very possible. It is unclear which one is true. I would say between the two, if you're looking for Iran's point of view, Press TV will be the one to give it since it's Iranian media. A female middle school student opened fire on classmates in Rigby, Idaho on Thursday. 2 students and 1 adult were injured, police said. The adult was treated and released from Eastern Idaho Regional Medical Center, while the 2 students, 1 girl and 1 boy, had non-life-threatening injuries. In what is a clear political victory for Prime Minister Boris Johnson in Britain, the town of Hartlepool in northeast of England has just elected the Conservative candidate Jill Mortimer. This is the first time since the constituency was created in the 1970s that a Conservative will take the parliamentary seat. It is also not a good sign for Keir Starmer. And maybe this is where we should probably have a conversation. So Keir Starmer, who took over as Labour leader for one Jeremy Corbyn, we have this weird situation where they're losing seats that they've had since the beginning. And the question has to come out as to why. Does it have anything to do with basically trying to destroy Labour and trying to destroy Jeremy Corbyn, something that Keir Starmer has done? You had this weird situation where Britain, or let's say Jeremy Corbyn, was put in an odd box of, despite the fact that he is a Remainer, and one of those, not a Remainer, a Brexiteer before Brexiteers were Brexiteers. Well, he still gets stuck in this weird situation where many of the members of his party want to stay in the European Union. He probably wants to leave, but can't say because of the political currents. And you have a public and a country that basically voted to leave in a referendum. Now, if Jeremy Corbyn can't come out and say, yes, I am going to accept the referendum results, then he is opening a path for Boris Johnson to scream, I am freedom and democracy, I am Boris Johnson. You said you wanted to leave. I am going to be the guy that takes you out. So where does Corbyn go at this point? He can't make the argument that he wants to leave. That has been taken by Boris Johnson. He can't make the argument entirely that he wants to stay because of the referendum. So he floated in this ridiculous position in the middle. The elements of his party, the Keir Starmers of the world, knew exactly what they were doing when they were putting him in this position. And what was greatly expected, he got crushed. Not just crushed, they lost seats that they have never lost. Well, Keir Starmer is now leader of the opposition. And as leader of the opposition, is Keir Starmer going to do any better? Well, Keir Starmer is basically a Blair rewrite, and the answer is no. He's not doing any better. In fact, you can make a case Keir Starmer is doing worse. He is the worst version of Labour. And part of that worst version of Labour has to do with him not really giving anything different. I mean, whatever you want to think of Jeremy Corbyn, Corbyn was a distinction. He was something different. He was bringing Labour back to what Labour was, as opposed to the new Labour, quote unquote, of the Blairites of the world. I would make the point that says Labour is going to get crushed in these upcoming elections. And I know their local boards and everything else is not for the main parliament, but they are going to get crushed. These local elections on some level, they believe are like tea leaves of what is taking place from the perspective of the public towards the parliamentary system. Well, if you have a situation where Labour is losing seats that they never lost, that bespeaks of something. And the person who's head of Labour at this point is one Keir Starmer. And that one Keir Starmer is going to be on the receiving end of a brutal, brutal loss coming up. That's my guess. I could be wrong. But fact of the matter is, what has Starmer done that has given them this kind of want to go to Boris Johnson? The vaccine rollout has been going relatively well, so you can't even really hit him on that. And from the standpoint of the party politics stuff, yes, Bojo has his issues with the issue of Brexit. But do they honestly believe that Starmer, somebody who didn't necessarily believe in Brexit or Labour Party, that has basically said, we don't care about the referendum? Because that's basically what the Blairites of the world has argued, what the Keir Starmers of the world has argued. We don't care that the public chose to leave. We want to stay, and was willing to blow off the referendum. So a public that sees somebody in that political position, not to mention the destruction of Jeremy Corbyn and the basic pure elimination of the left, why would they ever get any kind of political clout in the situation? And the answer is that they won't. Those are your headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment with Tyler Nixon. Back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't.
Hey, Jamarl.
Yes, can you hear me?
Hey, Tyler is in 15.
Want it?
Daily from noon to 2
Oh,
p.m.
right.
Eastern
I'm sorry.
Time.
You're right.
Okay. Satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. At the very least, usually I will be joined by my indispensable co-host Shane Stranahan, coming out of D.C. If you guys are in the area, you guys can listen to us at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We are also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. We are in a very weird political climate. Very, very weird, and that's to put it mildly. You've had the woke left raising the hand of the intelligence services over the course of pushing back against one Donald Trump, deifying what they, for the longest time, reviled. Meaning, from the standpoint of the left, the intelligence services had worked to basically undermine those services. And despite the fact that the intelligence services have worked to undermine the left over the course of history, well, opposition makes strange bedfellows. And in this opposition, you have the woke left, Democrats, backing people like Nicole Wallace, or backing people like Steve Schmidt. Basically, these Republicans that are angry at Donald Trump. And on some level, the Democratic Party has moved so far to the right that these guys are, on some level, in line with their ideological thinking. It's very weird. If you woke up, let's say 5 years ago, and I told you, hey, they're going to be backing George Bush, he's going to get a reinvigoration. They're going to be backing Nicole Wallace, the person who was basically helping out Sarah Palin. And there's going to be a contingent of Republicans that Democrats love. You would think I am crazy. No way that happens. No way. And yet, here we are. Even with the raising the hand of the likes of Liz Cheney, the Darth Lord daughter. Shocking and yet true. Liz Cheney has pushed back against what you would call the Trumpism of the world, or let's say the Trumpism of the Republican Party. Now, to understand the gravity of Trump in regards to the Republican Party, take, for example, what is the gentleman's name? McCarthy. Kevin McCarthy, minority leader in the House, January 6th, in his office. Trump, Trump, Trump. He hears people screaming outside. He sees a crowd of massive human beings with Trump signs, angry, contorted faces, screaming, Trump! Now, what does McCarthy do here? He's freaked out. He's terrified. Like any other human being would be freaked out and terrified when a mob basically is trying to break into your office. McCarthy is on the phone with Trump. And McCarthy is screaming at Trump, basically saying, who the F do you think I am? Because Donald Trump is saying something like, well, maybe you don't care about the election results enough, or maybe you don't care about the election. Again, the big lie. This idea that Donald Trump won, not just won, but won in a landslide. And that many of these Republicans have basically taken on as their banner of resistance. It's like wearing masks all of a sudden becomes a political item, where the belief that Donald Trump won an election that he didn't win, and not just didn't win, but supposedly won it in a landslide, that has now become dogma. That has become the non-mask political, or the political equivalent of not wearing a mask. It is very bizarre. And yet, this is what Republicans have oriented around. And not just oriented around, become a banner of identity. Think about that. The idea, this huge lie that Donald Trump won in a landslide, and the world, the society is just oriented around him because the Democratic Party has all of these machinery. This has become what these guys have basically organized around. Liz Cheney saying that's not true, all of a sudden makes that a revolutionary act in the Republican Party. So the gold statue of Trump that these guys were toting around, McCarthy, despite the fact, screaming at Trump in 1 minute, gets out and says, yes, Trump has a role in his party. And not just Trump has a role in his party. They are basically castigating Liz Cheney for her, quote, resistance, unquote. And here we have a new member to the resistance. Dark Lord daughter herself, Liz Cheney. If you could look back 5 years ago and somebody said Liz Cheney would be this kind of new woke resistance player, you would be shocked. And yet, here we are. Liz Cheney is not your friend. Just because Liz Cheney comes back with the argument, the rational argument, that Trump didn't win this, But that doesn't make her your friend. This is infighting within the context of the conservatives in regards to what conservatives are and what conservatives are going to be. And I have to be honest, I don't quite know what that is. I would make the case that says if conservatives were going to change anything, they need to change in a way that is more, that is amiable to the population. Right now, these guys are running with the logic that they don't particularly care what the U.S. wants. They don't necessarily care what the U.S. even needs, and they're basically running under their own thought process in the interests of the people putting money into their pockets. That is not dramatically different from Democrats, and on some level, the only reason they could get away with that is because Democrats were doing the exact same thing. What happens when Democrats go a tick to the left and they start arguing, we're doing this for America, we're doing this for America, we're doing this for America? And Republicans, who at one point could argue and make these arguments of, oh, they're putting all of this money, they're spending all of this money, etc. Well, if Democrats are overly worried about that, then that's somewhat of an issue that they would conform around. But if you lose 600,000 people, that shit doesn't work. That dog doesn't hunt. That stick doesn't hit. I hope you understand what I mean. When the political situation changes, where a large number of people have died, where tens of millions have lost their jobs, and you, as the Republican Party, are still with the shtick of, oh, these guys are spending too much money. This is socialism, etc. That dog doesn't hunt. The public doesn't care. What the public sees is that 600,000 people have dropped dead, have went up in smoke. What the public sees is there was some level of malfeasance on behalf of the government that caused those people to drop dead. What the public sees and hears is a competition against China. That's what Biden is making this out to be. We're doing this for America. We must increase our infrastructure. We must do better in regards to our roads and bridges and water systems, etc., etc. We're doing this for America. What is your fight against that? How do you push back against that? And can you continually use tax and spend as a way of pushing back against somebody who's screaming, we're doing this for America. We're doing this for America. Why don't you care about Americans in the way that I care about Americans? That is going to be the argument. That is going to be the hit point. And that is something that the Republican Party has not had any resistance towards, especially in this political climate. It's not that Joe Biden has done anything magical. In fact, Joe Biden really hasn't done anything at all but say stuff. Oh, $15 an hour minimum wage. He's so edgy. He's the new FDR. Hey, unions. I believe in unions. Oh, he's the new FDR. I get that he's saying these things, but what is he actually doing? And is he willing to put the urgency and the energy into getting those things passed? And despite that answer up to this point being no, he is still head and shoulders beyond where the Republican Party is, who's at this point complaining and arguing about children's books. And yes, they're getting some lead off the border, but that's a finite lead. The point of the matter is, are you going to change? Are you going to make adjustments? Are you going to do what basically the Eisenhowers of the world needed to do, where they make the point of the New Deal is what is going to be the law of the land going forward, and anybody who's not on board can get the frack out? He did that on some level because he needed to do it. There becomes a point where the political space changes in a way that has a gravity about it. And the same way that Donald Trump has a gravity about him and what it means to be a Republican, well, the same thing becomes true for political space. You have a political climate that is fundamentally changed. And one of the parties hasn't necessarily acknowledged or noticed the fact that it's changed, despite the fact that the other party has only done so verbally. I don't know what is in Joe Biden's head. No clue. I do know that from a political space, what he's doing is apt. What he's doing is what he should do. And he is not even taking full advantage of the situation. A person credibly could get out and say 600,000 people have dropped dead and I need the population to back me in trying to get Medicare for all accomplished or trying to get $15 an hour accomplished. Meaning the number of deaths and the situation to which you are in allows you a flexible point by which to articulate your political wants. In the case of an emergency, you get a certain flexibility in this. Joe Biden is not using the flexibility in this, not in the way that he could. However, he is using it to the degree of saying, I want to get all of these things accomplished. We're in a competition with China. This is a competition that we need to win. So I want to spend a little bit of cheddar on these items. No, I will not do the PRO Act, something that is that big. No, I will not do $15 an hour. Both of these things will be directly beneficial to the population in the way they're putting money in their pockets, or for that matter, backing these guys in regards to unions and whatnot. Biden will not do those things because the people that are putting money in Biden's pocket don't want him to do those things. By the same token, he will give vocal support to it because he realizes, A, he needs the backing of the members and people that are on the left. He knows that coming up into the next election in the midterms, he needs to keep those seats if he's able to basically do what he wants to do and not be a one-term president. And so he takes a tick to the left. He gives the public what it needs, verbally. From the standpoint of action, not so much. But because the Republican Party has not changed tactics, they're still functioning in the 90s. They cannot accommodate what is basically a verbal tick to the left. They can't even compete with it. They don't even try. It's unfortunate because it's an unfortunate scenario for America. FDR made the argument that he saved capitalism. How did he save capitalism? He saved it from itself because it was going to basically eat itself alive. And it didn't necessarily understand that shared interest, shared concern is the thing that keeps the country together, not rank exploitation. FDR did it by giving back to the population to make them feel like we were pulling together. That has been lost. And I strongly suspect or suggest to you that a lot of the violence, a lot of the killings, a lot of the difficulties that people have in regards to these diseases of despair are related right to that, to the despair. If your population, if your public was happy, if it was thriving, if it was on some level prosperous, if the individuals in the various society had things to do where crime became irrational, would you have a different world? And I say, or suggest the answer is yes. Biden has the chance, has the potential, has the opportunity to change that world. He has the power to do it. The public gave him the power to do it. Whether he would do it or not stands to be seen, and I don't necessarily believe he will. But whether he does it or not, he's giving voice to it. And it seems that the Republican Party is completely incapable of pushing back. My case to the Republicans would be, come up with a platform, come up with something that is actually relatively popular that the public will be on board for. Even if you need to create opposition against Joe Biden from the standpoint of either foreign wars or, hey, maybe I'm not for the 15, but I'm for 10, and Biden is not. Whatever you need to do in order to create some level of opposition, you should do it. But right now, this looks comically ridiculous, and it doesn't necessarily seem that there is credible or clear opposition to what is at this point words by one Joe Biden. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment, this time for real, with Tyler
Fault
Nixon.
lines.
Every day we ask questions.
How is Facebook going to prevent suicides?
Well, do you see this as being a human rights violation?
Are the cows really stinking up the planet that much?
To move ideas forward.
A gravitational wave is a ripple in the fabric of space and time.
I don't think the launch of the satellite proves anything at all.
Where do good ideas come from? We connect with independent thinkers, hear their ideas, and create stimulating debates on real issues.
The Dow is in a correction. As I said, commodities across the globe are collapsing. Why is that the case?
I have no Tyler.
global recession that is set to change because Iran has approximately about 50 million barrels, which it had put in storage during the height of the sanctions regime, and that's ready to be released as soon as possible.
Where is the money?
The super rich individuals and the world's biggest companies are able to hide money in tax havens.
Is there a solution to the crisis?
No, because I don't think anything useful has come out of any of the policy reform discussions with respect to financial reform.
They give us answers we aren't always prepared for.
What are the chances that the report would make Israeli authorities to review their policies towards the Palestinians?
Oh, probably zero.
This recession will be even worse than it was in 2008.
But that would be the nasty way for it to happen, you know. But because of Guantanamo, the U.S. is no longer taking so many prisoners, so instead of taking prisoners, they kill people.
A lot of people think that he's now unelectable and a bad leader.
Wow, there's just so much information to take in.
Pay attention, there'll be a test on this later.
Taking notes.
Welcome to the show.
Wow, this is crazy. We're definitely talking sci-fi over here.
No, Tyler.
People would never have believed this. Crazy times we're living in.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around this story. This is a fantastic story.
Yes, it is a fantastic story, and it's a worldwide problem.
Welcome to the party.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. And of course, Shane is not necessarily here today, but I am holding this down. We're waiting for one Tyler Nixon. He was Roger Stone's lawyer. But just to give a preview of what we're talking about here, we're talking about what seems to be a war or conflict within the Republican Party itself. And this is taken as a lightning rod with the one Liz Cheney. Now, yes, why would you think Liz Cheney, this hallmark, the big name in the Republican Party, would take issue? Well, Liz Cheney is in a leadership position, and whereas many of the Republican Party was bent to form and going with let's say a Donald Trump direction of things, well, Cheney didn't do that. Now, I strongly suspect that part of that is because of her name, Cheney. It gives her a certain gravity and a certain stick-to-itiveness in regards to her position. But this still wasn't enough to protect her from what has been basically an onslaught by Republicans that are trying to pull her from her leadership position. Well, Liz wrote a letter, open letter. Yeah, Liz wrote an open letter in the Washington Post. And I'll just read part of it. In a public statement again this week, former President Donald Trump has repeated his claims that the 2020 election was a fraud and was stolen. His message, I am still the rightful president and President Biden is illegitimate. Trump repeats these words now with full knowledge that this type of violence January 6th provoked. Her point is very clear. You guys are still screaming that Donald Trump won this election. And I, Liz Cheney, am not on board for it. Cheney writes, the Republican Party is at a turning point, and Republicans must decide whether we're going to choose truth and fidelity to the Constitution. In the immediate wake of violence on January 6th, almost all of us knew the gravity and the cause of what just happened. We witnessed it firsthand. That is true, by the way. Kevin McCarthy, like I said, was in office. He was in the Capitol at the time where the Capitol was being attacked. He was scared. He was terrified. He was screaming on the phone. And yet, the political gravity of events still has him come out and basically say Trump has a role in his party. Right here, House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy left no doubt in his public remarks on January 13th on the floor, the president bears responsibility for Wednesday attack on Congress by mob rioters. He should have immediately denounced the mob when he saw what was unfolding. Now McCarthy has backed away from this. Yeah, it's a good point for her to make. I mean, Kevin McCarthy wasn't the only one. Mitch McConnell, minority leader, Mitch McConnell. Now, minority of the Senate minority leader in the Senate. Mitch McConnell comes out and gives this damning statement, a phenomenal statement. And the statement basically makes the point that says Donald Trump is responsible. Donald Trump bears all responsibility. Donald Trump is guilty of sin. And yet, even McConnell, at the very end of that, however, says this doesn't warrant impeachment because the time for impeachment is past and he's no longer sitting president. These guys are making a political choice. They don't want to impeach their president. They don't want to go after their previous president. And as such, because they know that there's a large contingent of support for that same Donald Trump, despite the political difficulty of backing him in the standpoint of, let's say, the Washington space, there's still a groundswell of support for Trump. And they don't want to do anything to touch that. Nor do they want to be held, let's say, responsible if it's a situation where one of these guys, where Donald Trump is going against or going for. She continues, I am a conservative Republican, and most conservative of conservative values is reference for the rule of law. I don't buy that, but in her own conception. Each of us swears an oath before God and uphold the Constitution. The Electoral College has spoken. More than 60 state and federal courts, including multiple Trump-appointed judges, have rejected the former president's arguments and refused to overturn the election results. That is true. Again, whatever you want to think about Liz Cheney, the only thing she's getting credit here is for just saying reality is indeed reality. Very weird that that's what you would get credit for, but nevertheless, here we are. The question before us now is whether or not we would join Trump's crusade to delegitimize and undo the legal outcome of the 2020 election, with all the consequences that might have. Now, at this point, Joe Biden is president. And at this point, Kamala Harris will most likely be running after Joe Biden. I don't know how you would undo the election at this point. And if they're still saying that they're going to undo the election at this point, then they are basically looking for useful idiots. This is like saying you're going to become a doctorate from Trump University. It's bogus. That doesn't necessarily stop various people who have true believers who believe that somehow they're going to overturn the election results. And by the way, if you do that, what you're talking about is just ending the United States of America. Because what you would have on the other side of that is something fundamentally different. It would not be the United States. So right here, America is exceptional because of our Constitution. The system safeguards against basically these upheavals. At the heart of our republic is a commitment to a peaceful transfer of power among political rivals in accordance with law. Now that part she's right about. One of the most understated or underacknowledged aspects of our political system is the concession speech. And I've said this before. The concession speech is one of the most important devices in our political system. A candidate fights for God knows how long. And at the end of that process, everybody on that stage is an American. Everybody on that stage is part of a political party. Everybody on that stage is fighting to be the dog catcher of the year. I'm making the point that in each of the situations, you have people who are running against other people that they are somehow affiliated with, either in regards to, let's say, the same party, like you're running in the primary, or the same country when you're running, let's say, in a general election. All of the people who are running in these various elections are supposed to be under the auspices of America. Meaning regardless of the fighting, regardless of the bad names and things that you say to the other person, at the end of the day, all of you are still Americans. All of you are under the auspices of law, the auspices of us being in this kind of shared experience. And so at the end of that process, the fighting stops. At the end of that process, there is loyal opposition, and loyal opposition being opposition with the idea of the highest goal in mind being the country itself. What happens when that's no longer the case? Now, Cheney is making the point that All of us are playing this game. All of us agree to the rules of this game. And one of the highest rules of this game is that if we lose, we take our bag and we go home and we applaud the person who won. Trump didn't do that. And in not doing that, that has certain larger consequences. Some of those consequences is destabilizing to the country itself. We have tens of millions of people who are listening to Trump and listening to him say that this election was dubious, this election was fraudulent. And even in his speech, he makes the point of saying it's not the same thing when there's, let's say, this kind of political violence or whatever, or pushing back when the person didn't win the election. Meaning you're in a different space because Biden didn't really win, so he's not really sovereign in regards to the forces being dispensed. I mean, that's where this stuff was going. It's clear what happened. We saw the results of the rhetoric and the language that basically position those people in regards to the country itself. So this notion of not hitting on the point of the elections, if you notice, is something that's taboo. Kerry screamed he was going to push back and then didn't. Al Gore wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. And the reason is because it gets to this notion of sovereignty and this gets to this transition of power. And they are very dodgy at hitting the transition of power because they don't necessarily want to unravel that faculty of being able to transition without there being political violence. If you go to some of the other countries abroad, you can see what that looks like, where there's this continuous back and forth in regards to violence, where one side never accepts the fact that the other side won. If Cheney is to get credit for anything, it's at the very least noticing that. And that's pretty much it. Because that seems to be the thing that is the distinguishing factor. That seems to be the fight. That seems to be the thing that Cheney is getting credit for. And should she get credit for acknowledging reality? I suppose in the context where people are not acknowledging reality, on some level, I guess she should. But how small of potatoes that is. Cheney continues, while embracing or ignoring Trump's statements might seem attractive to some for fundraising and political purposes, that approach will do profound long-term damage to our party and our country. Trump has never expressed remorse or regret for the attack on January 6th and now suggests that our elections and our legal constitutional system cannot be trusted or the will of the people. This is immensely harmful, especially as we now compete on the world stage against communist China and its claims that democracy is a failed system. Well, according to Trump, democracy is a failed system because according to Trump, he was magnificently cheated. That it wasn't even a loss. He won this. Not just won it, but like 1 point or 2 points or 10 votes in a landslide. Yes, that does damage to the image and to the system itself. If the system is dodgy, then yes, you should push back on it. If there is some evidence that there is massive cheating, that Donald Trump won, then yes, he should push back on it. And this channel was open to the pushback, despite the fact that it's somewhat taboo. Our thing was, if there is any chance that Trump was cheated, then that is a big deal. That is a massive deal. That would be one of the biggest crimes. And as such, that should be explored. Every bit as much as I think Gore should have went for the notion of trying to determine whether he was being cheated, or for the matter, John Kerry. I wouldn't change my point of view just because it's Trump. The problem is, if you're not able to prove it, if you're not able to show it, if you are the president of the United States, you have all of these lawyers, you have all of these governors, you have all of these mayors, you have all of these people that represent you, that back you, that are looking for massive fraud, and they come up with bupkis. Under that context, how am I going to consider that you won, and let alone won in a landslide? What I think this is at the end of the day, this has become the birth certificate thing for Obama. This has become the mask wearing issue, meaning these things that are not political have at this point become monstrously political. So not wearing a mask in the middle of a pandemic is a sign of resistance against reality and good sense. And in this very specific case, Trump won in a landslide and has now become the dogma of the day. This is now the birth certificate under Obama, but in this case, under the Biden administration. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
So Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
You check tab.
We couldn't put it better ourselves. Tune in to Political Misfits on Mondays at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Miss the Press, our weekly takedown of Sunday's toothless news talk shows.
Fault Lines.
You muted. Hello? Jamarl.
Oh, I'm sorry. Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We were supposed to be joined with one Tyler Nixon, but we're going to go to callers at this point. So we have Tarif. In fact, if you guys want to call in, the number is 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. We were having a conversation about Liz Cheney, but you guys can basically have an open conversation. But that's where we're going with this thought. Tarif, what's going on, man? How's it going?
I'm doing fine. Thanks for taking that call, Jamal. I like to clarify, first of all, free Julian Assange. He's very important. Very important for freedom of press. I like to clarify something yesterday. I meditate. I don't take no psychoactive drugs. I forgot to separate those two when I say that ayahuasca do help people and iboga, but I just want everybody to know I made a mistake. I don't take any drugs. I don't
Tarif, that's nothing to be either ashamed about or even having to qualify. I would love to have went on a vision quest, because what you're talking about, ayahuasca, many people who are in tribes don't consider that a drug. What they consider that is this kind of spiritual, I don't know, it's almost like a being of sorts. Like if you take mescaline or if you take ayahuasca and you find yourself communicating with these elves, machine elves in the DMT experience or in the ayahuasca experience, these other beings that you're interacting with, that they consider you're interacting with, is it really a drug in the traditional sense? Especially if you are interacting seemingly with something. I mean, I think I would argue that we don't know enough about consciousness in and of itself to make this note that this drug is entirely just a drug in the traditional sense of getting high. It's unclear. Like consciousness is one of those things we assume that this is being originating in our brain and all this other stuff. We don't know that as a flat fact. We just kind of assume it. And so these drugs, ayahuasca and mescaline, or for that matter, DMT, if they find that over and over again that the people who are taking this stuff are communicating and talking to something else, an argument can be made that those persons are just talking to themselves. But do we know that as a flat fact? I'm not certain that we know that as a flat fact, even though I know that we consider those things drugs. I guess my point is, you don't need to qualify. I didn't take it as a negative one way or the other, and I didn't even assume one way or the other that you were taking drugs or anything. I just assumed that you were talking about meditation in and of itself. Tarif?
I'm not knocking ayahuasca.
Oh.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, I'm not knocking ayahuasca because one day I want to try it in the other psychedelics, but I want to do it where it's legal, and I want to do it mainly outside the United States because of the situation that I'm in. That's why I had to clarify from yesterday because we don't know who's listening to the show. But anyway, I'll almost go to Liz Cheney now. The Republican Party is changing. They're becoming more and more inclusive now, okay? There are Latino vote, the Asian vote, some Native Americans and African Americans too. Okay, they have to get, they got to push out if they want to change. Because she represents the old Republicans, the old, like, Bush Republican types. Now, if they don't push out, then they're going to struggle for the next 6 to 8 years finding votes because she's representing the old. And yes, Trumpism, the new type of view, a Republican view is taking over now. You know what I'm saying? Which is a good thing. And hopefully they can have some Republican liberals join their party and start asking for increasing minimum wage and Medicare for all and things like that. All right? That's all, so that's good. But Liz Cheney represents the old. She wanted to keep the troops inside Afghanistan. She was stopping Trump. She was turning the people against in the Congress. She was doing a lot. So she needs to be kicked out of a role of GOP leadership. She needs to be replaced, which is a good thing. And once that happened, then more people will come to the Republican Party. And I'm not Republican.
Yeah. So thank you, Tarif. Look, I agree with you on some level. I mean, the party needs to change. I mean, it's at this point where it's at this crossroads where Biden just moves a tick to the left and all of a sudden these guys can't compete, can't come up with an argument. It's almost like Democrats and Republicans were engaged in this kind of lock together. And as long as one was crappy and the other one was crappy, everybody was good. And then Biden says, hey, we're competing against China. I need to move a tick to the left. And all of a sudden, the interaction on some level is broken. Republicans are flailing. And it's like they can't find the lock-in. I agree with you with Liz Cheney. Liz Cheney is a neocon's neocon. And Trump and the wanting to pull the troops out and everything else, there are some elements of Trump that were positive. And I know that the woke Democrats want to act like that wasn't true, but his resistance to wars, for example, was one of those things, or at the very least, reluctance to get into these wars. That was one example of that. And that is not necessarily something that I see with the Cheneys of the world. So yeah, Tarif, agreed. We have John from D.C. John, what's going on, man? How's it going today?
Hey, how you doing, Tariq? Thanks for taking the call. I am enjoying discovering this station here just in the last week, and the conversation is good. I don't always agree with what I hear, and I think when we talk about this thing with Cheney, I think there's some very good points made, but there's some assumptions that I hear you saying that I think are a bad premise, right? So
explain.
It's not like these mindless Republicans following Trump. I think there was a lot of people, roughly a third of the country out there, that just felt like their voice wasn't being heard.
Agreed.
And the fact that the courts wouldn't take these things and prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that, Biden won was damaging to the system,
No, I don't agree with that one. I mean, yeah. I know, because look, if you think of it, Donald Trump is supposedly a billionaire. And the billionaire, they had Republicans all across the country that wanted him to win. So much so that they were doing whatever dodgy stuff they're doing with the voting machines, I think, in Arizona. And all of those people, energized to get Trump over the finish line, with the president screaming bloody murder that he was being cheated. None of those people could find the fraud that they were talking about. And in fact, I saw the other thing recently where the fraud that they found was basically somebody who was pretending or voting for Trump twice. Like how is that Biden's fault? And how is that not Trump's fault, the screaming that there's some nefarious going on?
I looked at the TV. I saw the lady putting the stack of ballots through multiple times. So did you.
No, I didn't see that. I didn't see that at all.
What?
That's kind of the point that I'm getting here. Where's, all of these people were trying to get Trump back elected again. So much so that they had to push against the Capitol. How? Like, what do you want Joe Biden to do to prove without a shadow of a doubt to you and to his supporters, people who there's no amount of proving? I mean, think of the birth certificate stuff. I mean, the moment that Obama showed the birth certificate, well, that's not a long form. If you showed a long form, where's this college or where's this high school records? It's that. And so it's like, yeah, I wouldn't want to go down that rabbit hole either. How is that Biden's issue, though? How is that not Trump's fault? That's like saying, for example, that the Trump and Russia stuff, that it wasn't Democrats' fault for screaming that Trump was working with the Russians. That's not Democrats' fault. It's Trump's fault for somehow not definitively proving it. Like, yeah, I don't buy that. It's like the guy beats his wife. And it's like, well, I don't beat my wife. Well, you need to prove without a shadow of a doubt that you don't beat your wife. Why do I have to prove without a shadow of a doubt when you don't have any evidence that I do? It's that. And I think that's my issue with this, that you have a president that basically screamed that the election was being stolen from him. But in the same way of Obama's birth certificate, there is nothing, like there is no amount of transparency that could have ever been given to prove that to millions. Or do you disagree with that, John?
I do disagree with that because there were thousands of affidavits. These things were not ferreted out. They were not disproved. These people came forward at the risk of being a felon to give false statement. Thousands of people were ignored, in multiple states. And in addition to that, it just so happens my wife was born in Venezuela, and she literally predicted what was going to happen with regard to the Dominion voting system. And just a couple of years previous, those same Democrats were in Washington saying these systems they should not be used because they're volatile. They are penetrable, and they are. I happen to be in cyber, and I know that those things are. They should not have ever touched an internet connection, and yet they did. There are things that are inconsistent.
I would agree with you on that part. That part I would agree with you on. That basically, I mean, look, I want transparent voting, like radically transparent voting. I don't even want people using the machines in the first place. I used to be a software engineer. All things being equal, I would prefer paper ballots and the way that they go about it. By the same token, I also know that the voting rights stuff that has taken place across the country, the Operation Cross-Check, where they were knocking various people off the rolls and everything else, Republicans don't have a clear conscience on this stuff. I mean, even the Bush v. Gore, the Bush v. Kerry, where they were thinking something at first was taking place in Ohio. I mean, Republicans can't do this stuff of when it works in our benefit, great. When it doesn't, we're going to scream to high heaven. And I'm certainly not going to participate in it. I would make the point to you that these companies and the people who are saying this are being sued, viciously so. And Fox has shut up about it. Newsmax has shut up about it. And they shut up about it because they know they're going to lose that lawsuit because there's no there to this. So we'll see how the lawsuits go out, and we'll see how this shake out, because this is going to the courts, John, one way or the other. They basically said that the company Dominion was cheating. Well, Dominion is now suing the pillow guy and suing what Newsmax and Fox News was terrified, so they shut up about it. So you're going to get your day in court, and you're going to get to see whether or not there's a there to this as it shakes out in the courtroom.
1 minute.
So let's do this. John, thank you for the call, man. I really appreciate it. And thank you for listening. Whether you agree with us always or not, that's not really the point. We have people who disagree with us all the time. So no, thank you, man. I appreciate it. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I'm your ever vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas. And in the right corner, or an independent corner, is typically my indispensable co-host, Shane Stranahan. He is moving with his bro, but he will be back on Monday in studio. That means, however, that you guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So let's get to the headlines. In the news, COVID infections are decreasing in the United States with 45,661 new infections reported on average each day. That's an 18% of the peak, the highest daily average reported on January 7th. There's been 32,676,728 infections and 580,336 coronavirus-related deaths in the country since the pandemic began. The COVID-19 pandemic has caused nearly 6.9 million deaths across the world, more than double the number officially recorded. A new analysis from the University of Washington's Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, HME, has estimated deaths go unreported as most countries only report those occurring in hospitals or of patients with confirmed infections, the reports show. The IHME is an independent health research organization that provides comparable measurements of the world's health problems and has been cited in the past by the White House, and reports are watched closely by public health officials. President Joe Biden on Wednesday threw his support behind waiving intellectual property rights for COVID-19 vaccines, bound to mounting pressure from Democratic lawmakers and more than 100 countries from angering pharmaceutical companies. Yeah, pharmaceutical companies in particular like this. And I don't know if you guys were paying attention, but the stock market plummeted from the standpoint of drug companies on word of this. This was something that Joe Biden had promised when he took office to Andy Barkin. Andy Barkin is the disabled gentleman. I'm not even sure if he's still alive at this point. I call that basically lying to a dead man. But Joe Biden didn't lie. He actually is, at the very least, putting his support behind this provision of waiving intellectual property rights. Whether or not this takes place or not is unclear. The United States has weight in this, but it's not the sole decision maker in regards to this particular item. At the very least, from the standpoint of the World Trade Organization. We also don't know whether or not this is something like the $15 an hour minimum wage or like the PRO Act. Basically, Joe Biden supporting something that he knows he doesn't necessarily have the power to push through, so he can support it full-throatedly, knowing that the provision is not going to work. It's unclear. This is one of those things where we're going to have to see how it unfolds. India on Friday reported a daily rise in coronavirus cases of 414,188, while deaths from COVID-19 swelled by 3,915, according to Health Ministry data. India's total coronavirus infections now stand at 21.49 million, while its total fatalities have reached 234,083. The South Asian nation has added 1.57 million cases and just over 15,100 deaths this week alone. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, at a joint news conference with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on Thursday, says that the United States strongly backed Ukraine's sovereignty against, quote, Russian military aggression, unquote, saying, quote, Russia has pulled back some forces, but significant forces remain on the Ukraine's border. He mentions that Russia has the capacity on fairly short notice to take aggressive actions if it so chooses. Blinken added that the United States was, quote, watching very, very carefully, unquote, even though it's unclear about the actions that Blinken will take. Blinken also warned that Ukraine was under a very serious threat from, quote, internal forces, unquote, including powerful oligarchs who thrive on corruption. To his part, President Zelensky effusively thanked the Secretary of State for his visit. In news that rocked Atlanta's political scene, the first-term mayor, Keisha Lance Bottoms, announced on Twitter that she would not seek re-election. Quote, as Derek and I have given thoughtful prayer and consideration to the season now before us, it is with deep emotion that I hold my head high and choose not to seek term as another or as mayor, unquote. Atlanta, like many other cities, has had a spike in violent crime, which opponents have basically seized on, but it's not entirely clear what her reasoning was for basically backing away from running again. She gained a huge amount of clout and a huge amount of national attention during the riots, during the George Floyd riots, where she basically came out compassionate but strong in pushing back on the protesters. Or let's say pushing back on the riots. That's more accurate. Per the New York Times, the United States and Iran could come back into compliance with a 2015 nuclear deal within weeks, a senior State Department official said on Thursday, on the eve of what could be a final round of negotiations before an amendment is brokered. Briefing journalists on the condition of anonymity, the senior official described the likelihood of an agreement before Iran's presidential elections in mid-June as both possible and doable. He did not rule out that it could be in a round of talks that begin on Friday in Vienna. And this is coming from the New York Times. Now, this is somewhat of a different take than Press TV, because Press TV is arguing that Iran won't accept nuclear demands from the United States. Europeans, Press TV says. Now, Press TV is Iranian media. Of course, the New York Times is basically media in the United States. Press TV has learned that Iran would not accept the new demands put forward by the United States and the Europeans in the course of the diplomatic process underway on the potential revival of the 2015 nuclear agreement. Press TV learned on Thursday that the United States and the European signatories to the deal apparently want the destruction of Iran's new generation centrifuges in return for a temporary suspension of some of the sanctions related to the nuclear deal, officially titled the JCPOA. This is while the JCPOA, Iran's advanced centrifuges, including IR-4, IR-6, IR-9, must be stored away under the supervision of the International Atomic Agency and not destroyed. I guess the point that I'm making here is basically the New York Times is recounting what they are being told by an anonymous official. And you can make the case that this Press TV is basically doing something similar. The truth is unclear on this point. I would say this, the reality is that if the United States want Iran to go back to the JCPOA, then the United States needs to get rid of the sanctions and needs to go back into compliance with the JCPOA itself. A female middle school student opened fire on a classmate in Rigby, Idaho on Thursday, officials said. 2 students and 1 adult were injured, the police said. The adults were treated and released from Eastern Idaho Regional Medical Center, while the 2 students, 1 girl, 1 boy, had non-life-threatening injuries in the event. In what is a clear political victory for Prime Minister Boris Johnson of Britain, the town of Hartlepool in the northeast of England has just elected the Conservative candidate Jill Mortimer. This is the first time since the constituency was created in 1970 that a Conservative would take the parliamentary seat. This is also not a good sign in the least for one Keir Starmer, for obvious reasons. Keir Starmer being the Labour Prime Minister, you would think that if the Labour Prime Minister was doing a great and decent job, that the Labour Prime Minister would not be losing in this way, especially seats that go back for the Labour constituency. Florida DeSantis signs new voting restrictions bill into law. And this, again, is using Donald Trump's claim of election integrity, but is using it in somewhat of a different way. This is Washington Post. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis on Thursday enthusiastically embraced former President Donald Trump's demand for tougher election law, signing into law a slew of new voting restrictions and a staged live broadcasts, despite previously touting how smoothly his state's election ran last fall. So DeSantis, our elections ran great. There was no problem in our elections. How dare you say there was some kind of fraud in our elections? But hey, just in case, let's pass a slew of new election laws that makes voting more difficult for certain constituents. It's great. DeSantis signing the bill, which he delivered live on Fox News morning program Fox and Friends, makes Florida the latest GOP-controlled state to impose new voting hurdles following Georgia, Montana, and Iowa. The Texas House took up a similar measure later on Thursday, and other states, including Arizona, Michigan, and Ohio, are considering their own bills. Now, right here, DeSantis offered a string of justifications for the law, claiming that it would prevent ballot harvesting and stuffing ballots into unmonitored drop boxes, though such practices were already prohibited under the state, and there is no evidence that this occurred last year. Quote, "We're not going to let political operatives go and get satchels of votes and dump them into some drop box," unquote, the governor said. This is pretty wild. So right here, DeSantis' vigorous support for the law, which he arranged to showcase exclusively on Fox News' signature morning program, is the latest example of the GOP's rush to align with Trump's false claims that the 2020 election was marred with fraud. Look, if these guys cared this much and they wanted to argue that, look, we need election integrity, we need to know that our elections are fair, we need to know that our elections are honest, I would have no issue with that at all. If the goal was, let's open it up where we know that each person has their voting ID, where every person, the moment that person is born, has their voting rights given to them. Or let's say when they turn 18 and their voting rights and given to them. Here's their voting pass. Everybody has it the moment that they turn. I would have no issue with that. But that's not what's taking place. There is a goal of making voting more difficult. And it's understood that if you can shave off just a few percentage points, then your party has a chance of winning. I mean, think for the moment of Wisconsin. Think of Ohio. Think of the vote tallies that were taking place in Florida, or for that matter, Arizona. The margins were so close that just shaving off a little bit of those margins, if you're a Republican, could potentially take it. Now, they're doing this instead of coming up with a platform that people would, vote for. They're doing this instead of coming up with policies and proposals that people would agree on. The thing of the matter is, Donald Trump was able to increase his margins. Well, so was Joe Biden on some level, because it was a mail-in vote. Would Biden have won if it wasn't mail-in? I don't know. Would Donald Trump have gotten many votes if it was mail-in? No, he wouldn't have. And in this very specific situation with the Republicans doing everything that they could to basically curtail the vote of various people that are not voting Republican, well, that's what these laws are. They're trying to find a way to mitigate what they consider to be a loss. And they're trying to mitigate that loss, not in the way of making a platform that is more appetizing or more appeasing to the public's needs. No, they're trying to do it by screwing around with the ability of the constituents to vote. They should be ashamed of themselves. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Those are your headlines. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and digs straight into the details. Set your clock to the critical hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Under normal circumstances, I'm joined by my co-host, but Shane right now is moving back to Washington, D.C., and so he will be here on Monday. But I have a great opportunity to speak to a guest that we often have on in order to tell us and explain to us what's going on with Myanmar. We have KJ No. He's a journalist, political analyst, writer, and teacher specializing in the geopolitics of the Asia-Pacific region. He's contributor to the book Capitalism on a Ventilator, once censored by Amazon. It is now available by iacenter.org. KJ, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
Absolutely. So I want to get directly into what has been taking place recently, because this is a very big deal. One of the big questions had to do with this notion of sovereignty. And sovereignty is an interesting thing. Oftentimes, what you would have is basically the country or the power broker of the country being the only one to distribute violence. It is the thing that is acknowledged, and it's even acknowledged from the standpoint of the public, when the public doesn't necessarily fight back or only does so in a defensive measure. Well, that seems to be bleeding off into not just a defensive measure, but into defensive groups that may be able to do offense. So it seems that the Federal Union Army, they're trying to do a Federal Union Army, and it has the responsibility to, and this is quote, to end decade-old civil wars and deal with military attacks and violence by the ruling state administration council. KJ, this sounds like a civil war, or at the very least the beginnings of a civil war. What is the latest that's taken place on the ground in Myanmar?
We are looking at the beginnings of a civil war. Now, that said, we have to specify or clarify that the country has been in various states of civil war since its inception, starting 1949. This has to do with the fact that it was a colonial state administered by the British and created in this chimeric way where multiple different ethnicities were forced together in a very artificial cohabitation with an ethnic hierarchy of the Bama. And when the British left, these divisions were left, and these resulted immediately in civil war with ethnic organizations. And this has continued to the present moment. So the sovereignty of Myanmar is really a fractured sovereignty that has only largely been held in place by the Bama majority military, the Tatmadaw. That said, currently at this current moment, we have over 750 people killed, over 3,000 detained, and thousands of arrest warrants. And we see right now that the escalation has resulted in heavy bombardment. We're talking about jet strikes and helicopter strikes, with also the killing of probably about 200 troops by the Karen National Union, 200 Myanmar Tatmadaw troops, and helicopters being shot down. So this has all the characteristics, as you point out, of a civil war. That said, there's some other trends that are going on. A trend towards creating a federal unified army is not quite solid yet. We've seen the first steps, but there are still holdouts because, as we mentioned before and as we predicted, the armed ethnic organizations are key players, and there are several EAOs that do not trust the current government in exile and have placed their bets with the military. The other factor is the fact that the ASEAN states, the 10 states of the ASEAN, have come together and put forth a 5-point plan for de-escalation and dialogue. In doing so, they inadvertently also gave legitimacy to the government. So there are multiple scenarios evolving at the same time.
It's quite fascinating. I mean, the national unity government, that basically comes across as, okay, we have a different power center from the military itself. Like, it's you can see this kind of organization taking place that is pushing back against the military's rule and dominance. And so whereas the military once before had this kind of power structure and it was accepted as so, it is not being accepted now at all. I mean, is this directly, I'm asking, but is this directly related to Aung San Suu Kyi and her time in power? I mean, the country basically had this kind of feel for democracy, whether it was flat fact true or not. That was basically the feel for it. And is it just once tasted, you can't give it up? And hence you have this level of pushback from the military junta. And beyond that, what are they thinking right now? I mean, their assault, their attacks, the killings, none of that stuff has worked. And now they're seeing basically the society itself leveling up in order to not accept military rule at all. So everything they threw at the public, for the most part, came to naught. And now they're having a public that's basically fighting back. What on earth is in the military's mind at this point?
You know, I don't have a crystal ball or a direct channel to the military, so I can't tell you what their thinking is. But we can look at actions and intention. As we can see, you know, they are putting a lot of their bets on the ASEAN-mediated process. That is, there's a 5-point plan for cessation of violence and constructive dialogue with all parties, appointment of a special envoy, humanitarian assistance, and meetings with all parties. What is not in the ASEAN 5-point plan is an agreement to release prisoners. And that's striking, which means that not only is a certain degree of legitimacy conferred on the Tatmadaw, but also that they are having a strong hand in how this process will unroll. So the military has a two-pronged strategy. One is this ASEAN-mediated international process, and the other is the iron fist with which it's shutting down protests and also bombing and strafing ethnic regions and ethnic resistance. But once again, we have to be clear here. There are differences between what the ethnic organizations want and the Bama majority want. There's a difference in priorities. The NLD wants the release of political prisoners. They want the election to be ratified, and they want their notion of democracy. On the other hand, the ethnic groups want an end to dictatorship, and their focus is on the creation of a federal union and the abolishing of the 2008 constitution. So there's a slight difference in emphasis, and it still remains to see if all the parties are on board and can come together to work together.
That's a really good point. I mean, because under the original government, you had all of these groups having to basically agree. And with the military taking over like this, and I'm glad you make the point about legitimacy, because basically if there's let's say a dialogue that is taking place, on some level, the people who are engaged in the dialogue have to have some level of legitimacy in regards to being in power. And so it almost establishes the military in power as being the negotiating hand in that. That's fascinating. From going with that logic, though, have the ethnic groups, how have they broken down so far? I know the Karens are supporting the national unity government, but what about the other armed ethnic groups? You made the point of saying once before that some of these ethnic groups are heavily, heavily militarized. They would have to buy into whatever governmental plan that's constructed. How have these groups so far broken down, especially from the standpoint of the military? Has the military been able to encourage any additional groups, ethnic groups, to join its side, or vice versa from the standpoint of the unity government?
Well, what we see clearly is Kachin State, Kachin Independence Army, and the Karen National Union, Karen National Liberation Army, and they've been fighting since 1949, are engaged in direct warfare with the Tatmadaw. The Shan State or the Shan State armies are the Restoration Council is still sitting out on the fence, but it looks like it's leaning towards supporting or working with the KNU and the KIA. On the other hand, the Mon Unity Party and the Arakan National Party have actually joined the State Administrative Council of the Tatmadaw. At the same time, the Arakan Army is also aligning with Kachin State. So it is a very complex chessboard right now. And it's hard to say. The upshot of it is that there are clear actors who are opposed to the Tatmadaw, and then there are other ethnic organizations that are sitting on the fence because they have had a very, very bad experience with Aung San Suu Kyi NLD. They see no distinction between the Tatmadaw and the NLD. And on the other hand, you have groups that have actually allied with the Tatmadaw. So all of this remains to see how it will fall out. I would not put too much. I would not place all my bets on the federal army. It remains to see if that's indeed pulled off, because there's still internal split. And even inside the ethnic groups, there are top-down hierarchies that are not as robust as they seem.
Very interesting. So in the context of like the way this is breaking out, I mean, is your expectation of this a civil war? Or is your expectation, no, I think the military is going to get a handle on it at some point? Meaning, regardless of the energy that is put out by the protesters and everything else, at a certain point, that energy runs out. Like, how do you see this propagating at this point? Because it doesn't necessarily seem like it's slowing down.
You know, like I said, once again, nobody has a crystal ball here. But right now, the resistance was in this heroic phase. That heroic phase generally tends to exhaust itself unless it can consolidate rapid gains. We see the power of the military exerting itself in the sheer, technological and military force that they have. Are there enough counterbalancing forces among the AEOs to resist the military? I don't see that yet. Will the ASEAN process, will that calm the waters and lead to some kind of negotiated and hopefully federated democracy? That remains to be seen.
Like in every country or at every kind of pushback, there's always this question of how far is the ruling order willing to go? Meaning, how many people are they willing to kill before they're like, okay, too much? Like, so how much blood? Like in the U.S., where you had the civil rights movement, you had all of these people going to prison, being beaten, being killed, and the public could only accept so much of it. But this is a little bit different because this has gone beyond this kind of civil conflict. I mean, on some level. And so is there a point where the military is like, okay, I'm not willing to take that much killings, or at this point the chains are off? And I guess this leads to the question of other governments. I know China has a hand in this, especially with their outlets and their as a way of getting their supplies and getting around this idea of encirclement. And at this point, the United States and even the UN has started to take a heavier focus in regards to what is taking place in Myanmar. So, I mean, do any of these outside groups, in the way that it's being pursuing itself now with the call for sanctions and the call by the United Nations, are any of these groups having any sort of effect on the internal politics of the country?
They probably are. I mean, there are third forces that are clearly directing and influencing the situation. And clearly, clearly the U.S. is one. I mean, in the previous year, the NED funneled about $11 million worth of funding and training to civil society groups. So already that was an established, powerful force. And you see a lot of the discourse in some of the CDN, which is, clearly very much U.S. influence. So there is this third force. The U.S. is unhappy both with the NLD and the Tatmadaw, and it's trying to figure out exactly how to play this game. The Tatmadaw currently is courting the U.S. It had trained with the U.S. military prior to this, so there were strong military-to-military relationships. And they had been courting the U.S. by saying that, they had to do this coup because they didn't like the way in which the civilian NLD government had strong ties to China. And whether that's just purely a, political feint, whether that's actually true, that remains to be seen. But the fact is there are multiple forces on the ground. Certainly China has an interest. And remember, many of the ethnic groups along the border have a continuity with Chinese ethnic groups. So there's actually an ethnic, there's an ethnic alliance that also happens. And some of the strongest military forces, for example, the United Wa State Army, are also, strongly allied with China. That's just a fact of the regional proximity and propinquity, which is, a geographical fact. So, once again, third forces will have an effect. But right now, we have to see what the ASEAN process will yield, and also whether the military will back down or diminish its level of repression.
Well,
that remains.
That's a really good point. I mean, the ethnic groups themselves. I mean, do you believe that the United States? Okay, so the United States has opened up this notion of competition, the deep competition, or whatever they call it, and this has run everything from they're committing genocide, despite the fact not really having much to base this on, or base it at all. And it comes across as just hyperbolic way of trying to get other countries to not work with China. They basically trying to find some way to limit the economic output of what is basically becoming an economic powerhouse. So it comes across as, just hyperbolic. But I would imagine the various ethnic groups may have their own ideas of allegiances in and of themselves. And with those allegiances or those chosen potentials, meaning I would imagine some of these groups may prefer to work with the West or the United States, and others may prefer to work with China. Or does it break down in this way? I mean, you mentioned that the National Endowment for Democracy, one of the NGOs, basically a front of the CIA for all intents and purposes, was basically putting a lot of money out in the region. So is that indicative of a heavier Western influence in regards to the various ethnic groups, or not so much? I mean, how does that break down? Or am I asking this question right?
Repeat, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. So the various ethnic groups that are in the country, I mean, if the National Endowment for Democracy was putting a lot of money out in regards to spreading the cheddar around of sorts, I would imagine that's going to get a certain degree of influence. By the same token, China has also been dumping a massive amount of money in Myanmar in regards to the Belt and Road Initiative. So how, is there a split in regards to the various ethnic groups with going, let's say, to the U.S., or some ethnic groups going to China, or it's not breaking down in that way? I mean, this really is just internal domestic politics. Which way?
It's both. It's both. There are clearly certain ethnic groups that are more aligned with China, simply because they're so deeply opposed to the NLD and the way it was backed and supported by the West. And then the NLD did not deliver on its promises to the ethnic groups. And on the other hand, clearly, there's strong U.S. influence among the civil society organizations. For example, they were able to prevent the Chinese construction of a massive dam, the Irrawaddy Dam, that would have essentially electrified the whole area. So there are multiple factors going on. But the key point that you make is the most important point. If we pan out and we look at the large picture, we can see that the U.S. And China are in great power conflict, and the U.S. is waging information warfare against China, as well as encircling it with 400 bases. And this is the core of the issue. The Burmese find themselves at the juncture of a critical moment in history at one of the key areas of geostrategic importance. And that's why there's so many factors playing. And that's why it's almost impossible to predict how this will play out, because there's so much complexity going on. All we can say is this is a crisis. The stakes are huge, and there's tremendous human suffering going on.
Wow. Can we go just for a moment to China? I'm very curious about the Chinese government and how they're dealing with this level of conflict or this level of competition that is taken out. China often comes across as wanting win-win scenarios. Like the United States was complaining about China's quote-unquote vaccine diplomacy. And basically the complaint that Jen Psaki made was that they weren't giving strings. They had no strings attached. They were basically giving the vaccine to people who needed it. And it's like, how dare they do that? Like they're ingratiating themselves by giving this stuff as opposed to actually having some kind of strings attached. Well, has China gotten to the point of recognizing that the United States is not looking for a win-win relationship, that it's existential to the U.S., that it's on top or the world is at risk? It's that type of thinking. And so the idea of, okay, let's work together for the common interests of the world, that doesn't apply. From the standpoint has China changed their thought process in regards to how they're engaging the United States over the course of the last decade?
I think you're correct there. I mean, the U.S. foreign policy and the U.S. society itself is a fear-based society. And this is the problem with being a thief or a murderer, is that you think everybody else is. So in U.S. doctrine and ideology, any non-compliance is an existential threat. That applies in particular to African-American men in the United States, but it also applies to foreign nation states. If it's not subjugated, it's a threat that has to be taken down. And China is a threat in the same way. If they don't immediately comply and subjugate themselves to the U.S.-led international order, then it has to be taken down. It is a threat. Now, the fact is that China actually does have the capacity to defend itself. It's not a huge defense budget. It's about, China spends about $175 per person on their defense budget, as opposed to the United States, it's about $2,350 per capita. So it is not a huge military budget, but China has a defensive capacity. And that defensive capacity, which the U.S. refers to as anti-access area denial, is considered to be a threat to the United States. That is to say, the fact that it can resist being taken down, resist attack or deter attack, is considered a threat in and of itself, kind of like the Panthers were considered to be a threat. And therefore, this is the heart of U.S. doctrine and ideology that sees China as a revisionist power, i.e. an enemy.
Let's go into that for a moment, because this kind of comparison with African Americans, I want to linger there for a bit, because what I see when I look at the world and I look at the way the United States engages the world, even not just the U.S. in the standpoint of politicians, even the press, like the guardrails that they have on their thinking when they talk about stuff, it's very weird and very warped. So you can't bring up that the U.S. was toppling governments in South America, and those toppling has had negative consequences in regards to destabilizing those countries and having those people come to the border. You can't have that conversation. You can have the conversation about what is Biden going to do about the border, but you can't get into the real rationale and reasons as to why, even the State of the Union speeches. It's this weird America exceptionalism thing where they act as if America is somehow a moral arbiter or, the standard, and everybody else is somehow lesser. Britain used to look at the world like this, like the white man's burden, that, we have to carry the world. We didn't want to do this, but we got to carry the world, as if the other countries told Britain to invade and to put in these kind of, racist laws. But that policy or those racist laws stick in the consciousness of individuals. And so you get this weird belief that it is the U.S. paternalistic right to dictate to other countries. And the moment that those other countries say, what gives you the right for that, there's conflict, meaning the policy of the United States is perpetual conflict by anything that doesn't necessarily acquiesce to the demands or the wants or the push of the U.S. I guess it gets to this notion of what is China or what is in the head from the standpoint of China's policy. We're dealing with a country like that, knowing that there's this kind of weird racist operation that takes place just in the framing of the world and the thinking and the placement of where China is. It's very strange and very bizarre. How does China accommodate that? What are they thinking about it? That's the first point, because it has to be obvious in the way that the U.S. talks and the way the U.S. engages. Also, and maybe I'm asking this in somewhat of a different way, what are their plans to deal with it going forward?
I think we should take the Chinese on their word. Xi Jinping on January 24th spoke to the World Economic Forum, and his essential message was that to jointly promote strong, sustainable, balanced growth of the world economy and to abandon ideological prejudice and follow a path of peaceful coexistence, mutual benefit, and win-win cooperation. He said, no two leaves in the world are identical. Each country is unique. None are superior, and therefore no other country should impose its system on another, because every culture and social system has its own particular situation. Now, that's what they say. There's tremendous skepticism in U.S. foreign policy circles simply because of the viewpoint of American international relations. Essentially, international relations theory says that all states are self-interested. There is no overarching authority to mediate conflict, and there's an epistemic blindness about what other states are intending. And therefore, this always leads to competition and conflict. Now, we also have to note that so much of this is projection. This is Western projection. As you pointed out, the United States has been in perpetual conflict. I will actually put a little precision on that. It hasn't been in perpetual conflict of the 250-odd years of its existence.
1 minute.
It's been about 19 years where it has not been at war. But almost every other year of its existence, 99% of its existence, the U.S. has been at war. And this war has been with countries that resist the global Western-controlled neo-colonial order. Any country that tried to break away from that order, where they were destroyed, coups, the regimes were changed, there were sanctions, savage, ruined. We can name, hundreds of countries, but China is the only country with the size and capacity to resist that takedown. And more than that, simply by size alone, it creates a new gravitational center that shifts Western global balance of power. That's the challenge. And the instability is that if the U.S. tries to prevent this by war or other violent means, then we are looking at a very, very dangerous situation.
The voice that you guys were listening to is KJ No. He's a specialist political analyst, writer, and teacher specializing in the geopolitics of the Asia Pacific region. He is a contributor to the book Capitalism on a Ventilator. Once censored by Amazon, it is now available at iacenter.org. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, The Untold.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back. Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. So, and Signal are in a bit of a war. And war may be too strong. Let's call it a battle. The world's largest social media platform is in a dispute with the popular nonprofit encryption messaging service Signal. Now, Signal said in a blog post on Tuesday that Facebook had blocked an Instagram ad designed to show Instagram users the amount of data that Instagram and Facebook collects on its users. Quote, "We created a multivariate targeted ad designed to show you the personal data that Facebook collects about you and sells access to. The ad would simply display some of the information collected about viewers, which the advertising platform uses," unquote. And they continue, "Being transparent about how our ads or how ads use people's data is apparent enough to get you banned." Signal wrote, "In Facebook's world, the only acceptable use is to hide what they are doing from their audience." So for an example, one of the ads, quote, "You got this ad because you're a teacher, but more importantly, you're a Leo and single. The ad uses your location to see that you're in Moscow. You like to support sketch comedy, and the ad thinks you like brag." Signal and Facebook wasn't into the idea and basically claimed that the account had been disabled as a result. Now, Facebook, to their credit, calls this a stunt and says that their ad was basically against violations or violated their rule set. To have a conversation about this kind of fight going on between our houses, we're joined with assistant professor at Loyola University, Chicago School of Law, and author of International Cybersecurity and Privacy Law and Practice. We're joined with Charlotte Schneider. Am I pronouncing that right, Scheider?
It's Scheider, yeah, but you're really, really close.
Excellent. Okay, Scheider. I'm horrible with names. That's what I'm asking. So the fact that I'm close.
That's perfectly fine. You tried.
Okay, yeah. The fact that I'm close, I'm gonna call that. I'm gonna applaud that because my audience know I can butcher her name. So, but Charlotte, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate you joining me on this. So this is a weird case.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely, thank you. So this is a weird case, and on some level, I guess it makes sense. WhatsApp is in competition with Signal, and Signal just so happens that Instagram is also owned by Facebook. And Signal uses their platform as a way of showing how much data the platform uses. And Facebook, horrified by this, hey, you can't tell them how much data we use, figured that we can't allow them to use the system for this. This is really interesting, though. And on some level, I like the fact that Signal is doing this because I do think people should have some clear idea on how much of their data is being used by Facebook. What is the problem with how much data is used on Facebook? Charlotte.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a natural tension here, I think, between what we would say are calls for transparency and explainability about how these systems work, and what the natural, let's say, business rights are, or business interests protect those practices, what we call trade secrecy. And so there's a natural tension between algorithms, how decisions are made, how data are stored, and what I would say are just ways to kind of protect your business interests. What I suspect happened in this case, and I'll just note on the side what's kind of interesting here, is that actually Signal produces an open source platform that all messaging applications can use, with the end-to-end encryption, what we call asymmetric encryption in this case. And so Facebook is actually using Signal's technology for its messaging app. So it's a little bit, more entrenched, those relationships, than maybe we would have originally thought. But what I imagine Facebook is doing here is they're trying to protect their intellectual property rights. And I'm guessing that probably in the terms of use or the contract they have with Signal's probably prohibited from trying to expose trade secrets, what we call reverse engineering, or similar.
Token, though, Signal...
Complicated situation, yeah.
Yeah, but by the same token, they're in competition with one another. And in an odd way, an opposite competition. I mean, Signal, like you say, asymmetric encryption, their entire point is privacy, secrecy, the idea that the information is not going to be stolen, etc. Well, WhatsApp and Facebook, on some level, and Instagram, are in the opposite business of basically everybody can see the information. Everybody can see the data. They want as many people as possible on Facebook. They want as many people as possible. So you get one that's involved with secrecy and the other one is involved with exposure of information. And so there's this kind of interesting loggerheads that they're coming to, almost based on the basis of their business, or let's say the behind their business. I mean, this is pretty fascinating, actually. I mean, from a legal standpoint, why shouldn't people control their data, though? I mean, what are the laws around people's ability to basically control and maintain their own privacy on this stuff?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, I'll say, Signal has been very overt in really trying to advance privacy interests. They've been really aggressive in that messaging, which is awesome. And as a privacy advocate myself, I tend to agree with that model of thinking. In the United States, we have what's called a sectoral privacy system. So what that means is we spend more time caring about areas that are more sensitive, like healthcare or banking, and less time thinking about general consumer privacy. That said, the Federal Trade Commission, certainly provides some level of at least enforcement and investigation about privacy topics. What I think actually Facebook would say is, well, we got your consent, right? We provided you with the privacy notice, you consented to it, and so, boom, now, we're protecting your privacy. We told you what we were going to do, and you still wanted to use the platform, and so that was your choice. I think many privacy advocates would, agree that that probably isn't sufficient, and maybe we need something that's going to be a little bit more protective of privacy. And, certainly me as an individual consumer, I would love to see how Facebook is making decisions about me. And I do applaud, Signal's approach here. I think the challenge is they already had a business relationship, and I know they're competitors, but a lot of competitors in the tech sector are also partners in some ways too. Even if it's not overt here for Signal, it was just using their open source platform. But other tech companies are more intertwined than that. So it's an interesting issue.
Well, there was a conversation that was taking place about whether or not people would have to pay for data usage. And I think what this boiled down to is the ideas of laws being passed to protect data, where companies will potentially have to pay for the data, or in which case people would have to pay to use the service. It's an interesting dynamic that seems to be taking place here in regards to privacy, especially in Europe, where it seems like the privacy thing is done a little bit differently than in the United States. Is there going to become some kind of legal, let's say, precedent, either in the US or around the world, where people's data are theirs? And if companies want to get their hands on that data, they would have to either compensate for the data, or I don't know. I guess the thing is it going to get to a point either in Europe or the US where companies, where data itself is going to start looked at as a resource, and companies would have to pay for that resource. Or not so much. I mean, I don't hear too much of that in the States. I hear more of that in Europe.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that so data is already a resource, right? We wouldn't have this whole controversy without that, if data weren't important. I do think that there is a difference between having rights with respect to your data versus having the ability to own your data. And so often when we talk about this, we'll switch between data ownership and data privacy. Even in the European Union, data ownership is something that hasn't really been heavily entertained by the enforcement authorities, the folks who control privacy enforcement, or folks that create those laws. In the United States, I think that it's one of the ways that we can get around some of the privacy issues we have, potentially, is by compensating individuals. But I still question to what degree that really is going to advance privacy.
Yeah.
Because a person's likely to say, okay, you're going to give me $5, take all of my data. And, the problem with privacy, I always quote the old Cinderella song, and maybe that ages me a little bit, but, you don't know what you've got until it's gone.
Yeah.
Privacy is like that. Unfortunately, you don't know how important it is until somebody does something with your data that you don't like. At the moment when you're trying to use a service or use a technology, you have no way of imagining what could possibly be done with that data downstream. And there's not a great way to communicate that either at the time that you're using the service.
Yeah, like 20 years later, what is the data going to be used for? Or if you had a bunch of programmers sitting in a room trying to figure out how to correlate this data in order to get some particular effect, the individual that starts don't know that in the way that it's being used. I'm curious on this issue of platform versus publisher, this Section 230 issue. I have a YouTube show, and as having a YouTube show, I often come to the conclusion that what YouTube or what Twitter is doing is as a publisher. I mean, they're making certain decisions that seem to go beyond this notion of harm and concern and everything else, and they seem to be using the language in order to justify some of the decisions to either remove or to maintain. From your standpoint, when you're looking at this from a legal point of view, how does Google dance between the raindrops on this idea of being a publisher versus being a platform? Because it seems like a lot of the decisions that they make, especially when it gets into this kind of nebulous choice, that a choice is being made. And in the context of that choice being made, when it's not clear danger, then it seems like they're acting as a publisher, and that Section 230 wouldn't apply. Could you explain this to us? I know that Section 230 is a sword and a shield. We have about 2 minutes left. But how are they able to basically dance between the raindrops on this? Please explain.
Well, I think that originally when 230 was created, we thought about information producers, versus the vehicles for that production. And that's maybe, I think, a more helpful way to think about it, because the world of publishing now is just so different, with social media and other types of things. So if you actually produce the content, then you would be in the category of publishing. But if you were just presenting the content, then you would be in the other category and avoid liability. I think the challenge now is that with social media sites and, other types of platforms, they're doing a lot more, to your point. So, what is exactly publishing? Is, for example, curating what a person sees, controlling what a person sees based on data you have about them, making, one type of article more visible or more click-worthy. Is that publishing? I think the problem is that our old conceptions of what publishing were about production. In certain cases, the platforms are not producing something, but they certainly are dramatically controlling how it's seen and who clicks on it and how often it's seen.
No, I appreciate that. And so we're going to have to end it here, though. And thank you for that, because this is one of those fights that keeps taking place, especially from the way we look at this. I mean, I guess the thing is maybe the laws need to change in order to accommodate our new reality. The voice that you guys were listening to is assistant professor at Loyola University, Chicago School of Law, author of International Cybersecurity and Privacy Law and Practice, Charlotte Scheider. You can follow Charlotte on Twitter at CyberSimpleSec, and that's CyberSimplesec. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. In the left corner, I'm your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas. And in the independent corner, he's not here, but there is typically my indispensable co-host, the one and only Shane Stranahan. And you guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Excellent. Interesting, really good show today, considering, pulling us on my own. We had a very interesting conversation with the various people, call-ins, having a conversation about the election and, for that part, about Liz Cheney and the attacks that are taking place against Cheney. And the very basic and straightforward question, even though it's not that easy to answer, what is the Republican Party? And is it Trump, or more like Trump, or is it more like Cheney? And fact of the matter is, it seems to be more like Trump, considering the attacks that are being leveled against Cheney and that they're trying to remove her. A little bit later, we had a conversation with Charlotte Scheider. We're having a talk about basically Section 230, and for that matter, the fight between the platforms Signal and Facebook. Signal works on the issue of privacy. Facebook basically works the opposite. Having programs like Instagram or Facebook, or for that matter, WhatsApp. These applications, as you can think about it, have more to do with putting information out and publicizing information, whereas Signal works on the issue of privacy. Well, Signal puts out an ad on Instagram that displays the amount of information that's being relayed by Facebook. Facebook didn't particularly like that and put the kibosh on Instagram's ad, or the ad that Signal put on Instagram. Now, Facebook's argument is basically that this was against our rule set. Instagram's argument is that Facebook didn't want to see how much information, or want users to see how much information was being displayed. Interesting fight between those two behemoths. But let's get into the headlines. In the news, right here. In the news, per Reuters, COVID-19 infections are decreasing in the United States, with 45,661 new infections reported on average each day. That's 18%. That's 18% of the peak, the highest daily total reported on January 7th. There have been 32,676,728 infections and 580,336 coronavirus-related deaths reported in the country since the pandemic began. The COVID-19 pandemic has caused nearly 6.9 million deaths across the world, more than double the official recorded. A new analysis by the University of Washington's Institute for Health, Metrics, and Evaluation estimated deaths go unreported as most countries only record the number of people who died in hospitals or patients with a confirmed infection, the report showed. The IHME is an independent health research organization that provides comparable measurements of the world's health problems and has been cited in the past by the White House as it reports are watched closely by public health officials. President Joe Biden on Wednesday threw his support behind waiving intellectual property rights for COVID-19 vaccines, bowing to pressure from Democratic lawmakers in more than 100 countries, but angering pharmaceutical companies who basically saw their stock price floored after the announcement. This is also something that Joe Biden promised Andy Barkin, the handicap activist, that he would do just that. So this is basically Joe Biden, at the very least vocally, keeping a promise. India on Friday reported a record daily rise in coronavirus cases of 414,188, while deaths from the COVID-19 swelled by 3,915, according to the health ministry. India's total coronavirus infections now stand at 29.49 million, while its total fatalities have reached 234,083. The South Asian nation has added 1.57 million cases and just over 15,100 deaths this week alone. Secretary of State Antony Blinken spoke at a joint news conference with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on Thursday. Blinken said the United States strongly backed Ukraine's sovereignty against Russia's military aggression, saying, quote, Russia has pulled back some forces, but significant forces remain on Ukraine's border. Also, Russia has the capacity to fairly, on short notice, take aggressive action if it so chooses, unquote. Mr. Blinken also said that the United States was, quote, watching this very, very carefully, unquote. Blinken also warned that the Ukraine was under threat from, quote, internal forces, unquote, including powerful oligarchs who thrive on corruption. For his own, President Zelensky effusively thanks the Secretary of State for his visit. There's a question of whether or not Biden is also going to make that visit, but with COVID being a big issue, Biden has basically not done so. In the news that rocked Atlanta's political scene or political realm, first-term Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms announced on Twitter that she will not seek re-election. Quote, as Derek and I have given thoughtful prayer and consideration to the season now before us, it is with deep emotion that I now hold my head high and choose not to seek another term as mayor, unquote. Atlanta, like many other cities, have a spike in violent crime, which her opponents have basically seized on, but it's not entirely clear whether this is her rationale and reasoning for not running. Per the New York Times, the United States and Iran could come back into compliance with the 2016 nuclear agreement within weeks, a senior State Department official said on Thursday, on the eve of what could be a final round of negotiations before an agreement is brokered. Briefing journalists on the condition of anonymity, the senior official described the likelihood of an agreement before Iran's presidential election in mid-June as both possible and doable. Now, the United States, or let's say Iran, Press TV, is given a different assessment of this, with Press TV basically making the point that says Iran is not going with what the UN and the United States wants. That basically the EU and the United States wants Iran to get rid of its new centrifuges, but Iran has basically said that is not going to be a condition under which we come back to the agreement. Fact of the matter is, if the U.S. wants Iran to come back to the deal, then the U.S. needs to itself come back into compliance. And what that means is removing the sanctions. This seems to be an issue of face saving on behalf of the U.S., but for as long as it tries to face save, Iran is not going to come back to the deal. A female middle school student opened fire on classmates in Rigby, Idaho on Thursday, an official said. 2 female students and 1 adult were injured, police said. The adult was treated and released from Eastern Idaho Regional Medical Center, while 2 students, 1 girl and 1 boy, had non-life-threatening injuries. In what is a clear political victory for one Prime Minister Boris Johnson of the UK, a team or town of Hartlepool in northeast of England has just elected the Conservative candidate Jill Mortimer. Now, this is the first time since the constituency was created in 1970 that a Conservative has taken the parliamentary seat. This is a great sign for one Boris Johnson. This is a horrible sign for one Keir Starmer. Now, you must understand, Starmer took over for Jeremy Corbyn. And in the context of taking over for Jeremy Corbyn, there's a question of whether or not he was going to be successful, whether or not he was going to be able to take Labour into a new direction. And what it seems like is that answer is no. Starmer was one of the people that were responsible for Labour basically undermining itself. Now, what I mean by that is when Jeremy Corbyn was running, the Blairites of the party took a position that Brexit was wrong and to basically blow off Brexit. But think about what you're saying for the moment. There was a referendum that said leave. And so if one of the political parties is basically saying we don't care about the referendum, that's like one of the political parties basically saying they don't care about what the public wants. Now, Corbyn is a Brexiteer before Brexiteer became a thing. So you can imagine how weird it is that a Brexiteer will be put into the position of not being able to own up to the fact that they're a Brexiteer. And the members of the party, the Starmers of the bunch, the Blairites of the bunch, were pushing Corbyn to basically blow off the referendum. Now, an argument can be made that Corbyn should have been stronger, that Corbyn should have stood by the all of that's true. But Corbyn decided not to do that. The point I'm trying to make here is that it was the Starmers of the world that was pushing Corbyn to take that position. And so now Starmer, being in power, what's going to happen? Well, what happened that we know of is that Starmer basically attacked the Corbyn wing of the party. And the Corbyn wing of the party was basically marginalized, with Jeremy Corbyn himself attacked and almost kicked out of the party. So you can imagine this split was never going to come to a situation where Labour was going to be united and powerful and everything else. Not so much. The opposite. A Chinese rocket is tumbling back to Earth this weekend. Now, as you know, I am a sucker for science stuff. I am a sucker for us putting things on other planets, for the air creation and everything else. We are going to get some physicists here to have a conversation about what that means and the potential for that. But in this very specific situation, we have a rocket that is falling back to Earth. This is the New York Times. A 10-story, 23-ton piece of a rocket is basically falling back to Earth. That said, the chances are not zero. Part of China's largest rocket, the Long March 5B, is tumbling out of control in orbit after launching a section of the country's new space station last week. The rocket is expected to fall back to Earth in what's called an uncontrolled re-entry sometime on Saturday or Sunday. Whether it splashes harmlessly into the ocean or impacts land where people live, it's unclear. Why China's space program let this happen again remains unclear, and given China's planned schedule of launches, more such uncontrolled re-entries in the year to come are possible. More likely than not, it's a mistake. I don't think they put something in space with the intention of the thing falling back to Earth uncontrolled intentionally. That would be weird. That would be bizarre. And so, yeah, I suspect uncontrolled part means that it was unanticipated. But look, if we're putting stuff into space and that stuff, mistakes are going to happen. And this is, again, one of those reasons why I really wish that we were going into space as a world, not as these individual nations that are at competing ends of one another. Well, one side put a flag on one side of the moon and the other side put a flag on the other side of the moon. I don't want that. If we're going to leave this planet, I would prefer us to leave as one world. And maybe that's naive. Maybe this is all of those decades of Star Trek that is bubbling up in me in the way that Shane would say. That may be true. By the same token, what does it mean for us to go into the universe in conflict? Are we going to have space battles where one team from China and Russia are fighting in space with one team from the United States and Australia or England? And is that really something you want? Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host, Shane Stranahan, or at the very least not joined today, usually indispensable, but he'll be back on Monday in studio. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We are also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet. Of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. And we will be taking calls at the end of the hour. But joining us right now is Mark Sloboda. He's an international relations and security analyst. Mark, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Jamarl, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on Fault Lines.
Thank you. And it's always an honor and a pleasure to have you. So I brought you on because I wanted to have a conversation about what is taking place in the Ukraine. Blinken visits, Secretary of State Blinken. Now, I've said that Blinken is basically Pompeo in drag. And what I mean by that is I have a hard time seeing the distinction between Mike Pompeo and one Antony Blinken. Both of these guys are war hawks. Both of these guys are bellicose in the way that they talk about conflict. Well, Blinken says that Russia has pulled back some forces, but significant forces remain on the Ukraine's border. He also makes the point that says Russia has the capacity on fairly short notice to take aggressive action if it chooses, and added that the United States is watching very, very closely. There was also some talk about NATO, which I still have a hard time believing that any other European nations would want Ukraine to be a part of, especially considering the conflict that's taken place. What are your thoughts on Blinken's comments? I mean, I guess it's not as bellicose as it was, but it continues to put the specter that Russia is just at any moment willing to invade Ukraine. And I think this is somewhat farcical. What are your thoughts on Blinken's commentary and his visit?
Well, first of all, your commentary, Pompeo and drag, I curse you, because now I have a mental image that I know I won't be able to get out of my head for days.
I'm sorry.
It's pretty horrible.
I'm sorry.
It's not entirely inaccurate. In fact, it's pretty accurate, but it's a horrible mental image, and thank you so much for that. I think the tone of the rhetoric was maybe somewhat less explosive, a little more professional, but no less full-throated support for this U.S.-backed regime in Kiev, and no less, demonizing and condemning of anything and everything Russia. And I think that there is a sense of make Ukraine great again that is really makes the Zelensky regime in Kiev much more comfortable to have Joe Biden's team back in power in Washington than Trump's team. Because, of course, Joe Biden was essentially the viceroy for Obama for the newly geopolitically flipped Ukraine after the putsch in 2014. So they're quite comfortable with him. And along with him, of course, it wasn't just Antony Blinken. Our old friend Victoria Nuland showed up she is now confirmed as the third most powerful person in the U.S. State Department, famous, of course, for choosing the next prime minister of Ukraine and handing out cookies to the protesters slash rioters that were openly, calling for the overthrow of the democratically elected Ukrainian government at the time. So quite photo demonstrative of the U.S. meddling in the country at the time, and the camaraderie and the joking atmosphere between officials of the two governments was certainly shown when talking to Victoria Nuland, the Ukrainian foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba. He joked that he has been missing her baked goods, her cookies. So that shows clearly, the close connection there. And it has to be said that, Zelensky himself, of course, was a comedian playing the role of a school teacher who accidentally became president on a TV show called Servant of the People.
Isn't that a coincidence?
Yeah, that's actually on Netflix. You can watch it with subtitles on Netflix. I strongly encourage it. Just don't believe anything you see there. And obviously, he's found the role of being president far more difficult than he did on his TV show. But he joked when they were having problems with the simultaneous translation. And he said to Blinken that it must be Russian translators. They're here. They're everywhere. Like that's something okay and totally not Russophobic or totally not, really condemning the American and the Ukrainian translators present, calling them, something that he refers to as the dire enemy of his country, or at least certainly of his regime. That is the type.
Unfortunately, that slur
but at the same time
goes fine here in the States. Like the Russian slur, like that. However it's used in the Ukraine, it flows by in the U.S. as if it's nothing. It's very bizarre in the way that it's used in this kind of xenophobic way. I am curious though, what is the talk in Moscow on the issue for the Ukraine? I mean, the United States talks about it almost uniformly as, Russian aggression. That's the way it's cast here in our media. And there's no secondary opinion to that. The idea that these guys are fascists doesn't apply. Or the idea that they're fascist militias that are basically Nazis doesn't apply. It's not necessarily something that is aired here. What you hear here basically is the Russians are putting pressure on Ukraine constantly. The United States is pushing back against it. And they even attacked Trump for not giving military weaponry or offensive weaponry, something that Obama wouldn't even do. Like the level and the way to which this conversation has moved is extreme. And anything weapon-wise that we're given to Ukrainians are going to be used to kill Russians, which makes it somewhat difficult that we give them weapons in the first place. And yet, this type of conversation and argument doesn't necessarily seem to factor here in the States. What is the conversation that's taking place in Moscow regarding the events in the Ukraine? I'm just curious.
Well, of course, in Russia, they regard what's going on in Ukraine and quite the opposite as U.S. aggression, as a U.S.-backed color revolution, resulting in a civil conflict in the country where at least East Ukraine, the Donbass, never accepted the overthrow of the democratically elected government that particularly in East Ukraine, they had overwhelmingly elected to represent them. They have never accepted the change of the government, and the frozen conflict in the country continues to this day. And there's a great deal of conversation about exactly what the U.S. is providing the regime in Kiev and why. And if we take a look at the numbers since 2014, U.S. taxpayers, because that's who gives it ultimately, have given $5 billion to Ukraine, or to more specifically not to Ukraine, but to the U.S.-backed regime in Kiev. And as a result of that and much else, Ukraine, on a per capita GDP basis, has become the poorest country in Europe, poorer than Moldova. So well spent $5 billion there. But of course, that is only a fraction of the tens of billions of dollars that the EU and the US have shoveled through the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, to prop up this regime in Kiev. And again, it has really gone essentially kind of nowhere into a black hole. And Biden has promised another $408 million in security aid this year, unspecified exactly what that aid will be this year. But we know that in some ways, Kiev was a little disappointed. And while Blinken showing up this early in Biden's presidency, right after a meeting with the G7 to Kiev, is regarded as a strong show of support. But nonetheless, a lot of the things that Zelensky, very personally asked for, and that his regime in Kiev, they didn't get. There was no commitment to U.S. patriots being placed in Ukraine. No commitments to air defense that they wanted at all. Zelensky personally wanted a membership action plan for Ukraine joining NATO, and there was no discussion of that at all. Zelensky asked for Russia to be cut off from SWIFT, the global financial transaction system that the U.S. has effective, complete control of. And Blinken said he didn't want to talk about that or any specific actions they might take. So there wasn't, a whole lot of firm, we're providing you this. It's just more kind of a rhetorical photo op and symbol of support. Blinken even toured a Ukrainian monastery with the head of the newly declared Ukrainian Orthodox Church with Metropolitan Epiphany to see the Tomos of Autocephaly, basically the religious agreement certified by the at least the Patriarch of Constantinople, which really doesn't, because it's Istanbul today, doesn't have that much of an actual constituency, but declaring that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is now separate from the Russian Orthodox Church headquartered in Moscow, which is actually a big geocultural split that occurred with the very active pushing of the U.S. and the CIA to get this done, because they're trying to decouple Russia from Ukraine, all of its past history, culture,
even the name,
as much as possible.
I mean, they keep calling Kiev Kyiv as opposed to Kiev. It's very weird.
That's the preferred Ukrainian transliteration of the name of their capital, and there has been a huge push, of course, since the 2014 revolution before the putsch in 2014. Russian was the most commonly spoken language in Ukraine on a daily basis, and was the language of a lot of media, the language of education, the language of, not to say that they didn't all study Ukraine and know Ukrainian, but many Ukrainians actually preferred it, particularly in East Ukraine, of course. But since then, there has been a very active nationalist Ukrainization push, to such an extent that it's become extremely restrictive of people who prefer to speak Russian. In fact, recently they've criminalized use of Russian in the service industry, in the public sector. They've placed huge restrictions on media, education, and entertainment, and to just ridiculous extents, such that Zelensky, the comedian, he filmed several most of his movies were filmed in Russian because that was, the language of entertainment between the two countries, at least until a few years ago. And a lot of his own movies are now banned in Ukraine. They can't be shown on the airwaves because they're the president's own movies. And when he was coming into office, he was really downplaying a lot of this. He was downplaying these West Ukrainian ultranationalists / Banderite fascists who formed the militias. He was really speaking as if he doesn't think these language restrictions are a really great thing and everything. And he was very much against Poroshenko and, very much came to power and to throw these Maidan bums out.
Yeah.
Popular swell. But when he got into office, he's doing exactly the same things.
Now, why?
Down to the military.
Let's do
because
this.
He's
Let's
a prisoner of the restraints of the regime.
Well, that's what I was going to get at, because I am somewhat confused on what seems to be a schizophrenic policy by the U.S. on this front, and maybe even on some level of Europe, because it seems like the ultimate goal is to get Ukraine either in NATO or at the very least have Ukraine where it is subservient enough to put troops on the Russian border. Meaning, I suspect that part of the reason that the U.S. is putting so much money into Ukraine and so many resources, it has nothing to do with whether Ukraine is a success in and of itself. I think it's more to do with trying to get them in the pocket of the U.S., meaning they want to surround Russia as a whole, almost similar to the way they do with China. And their plan is never to allow something similar to the Soviet Union to come back into fruition. The problem is that horse is out the barn.
That's the main thing.
That's
the main thing. They never want any reconstitution of geopolitical power in the former Soviet space beyond Russia. There's a long geopolitical trope that is commonly repeated that Russia with Ukraine as an empire, Russia without Ukraine is just a country and will probably fall apart on its own, even because of internal division. So that's pertinently the U.S. thinking is entirely geopolitically. They don't really care about Ukrainians or what happens. The U.S. is very glad to fight Russia until the last West Ukrainian kills the last East Ukrainian.
Exactly. Yes.
They're perfectly fine with that.
And that's the point that I'm getting at.
They would prefer a Ukraine that is stabilized and drawn into NATO and the EU, but a de facto NATO protectorate destabilized and denied Russia is a perfectly acceptable plan B. Much like Syria, it must be said. Much like the role of Syria more as an ally of Iran, of course, but of course it's also has a lot of allied relations with Russia as well. So there's a lot of the same geopolitical thinking at play there.
And by the way, I think something similar for Hong Kong and for Myanmar. Let's do this. Let's take a break, and I'm going to bring you back. You guys are listening to Mark Sloboda. He's an international relations and security analyst. You can follow Mark on Twitter at MarkSloboda1 and find him on Facebook at facebook.com/Gramsci, the greatest name ever. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We continue to be joined with Mark Sloboda. He's an international relations and security analyst. And we were having a conversation in the previous break about basically Russia and this push on the border using Ukraine as almost somewhat of a battering ram. Mark, I agree with you on this. Like that the countries, whether Ukraine is a basket case or not, is secondary to the objective of having it as somewhat of a battering ram to have troops either on the border or to use it as this kind of military place. I think the same thing is true for Myanmar in regards to the way China is potentially going to use that in the way that country became somewhat of a basket case. Hong Kong, like whether the country is falling apart or not is almost secondary. It's acceptable. And in the case of these countries, I think Ukraine is somewhat the same way. How, internally, from the standpoint of, I'm just ask internally because you're there, and so I'm curious about what takes place internally in regards to the thinking of the conversation with the country. The relationship between China and Russia. Now, China and Russia basically said they're going to put a station either on the moon or near the moon. Now, this is highly technological in regards to what these guys are doing, and it also bespeaks of the relationship basically getting closer. Now, I suspect part of the U.S. concern here is that these guys are getting closer, and that China, that horse is out the barn, and both of these countries together are a powerhouse and can bring other countries to their side. So this is no longer this issue of, okay, we don't want a reconstituted Soviet Union. Okay, fair enough. You didn't get a reconstituted Soviet Union, but the attacks that have been made has basically caused a bunch of other countries to cobble together. So you have Iran, Russia, Syria, China, and these countries basically cobbling themselves together to push back against the U.S. From your inside the country, what are you seeing in regards to reports on collaboration with Russia and the other countries around the world?
Yeah, a big marker of that is that polls out on Russians' attitude towards other countries and their relationship with Russia. Russian support of China as a Russian ally, Russian approval of China is up to 75%. 75% of Russians regard China as an ally and are very positive about relations between the two countries. And that's a pretty big high, considering that in the Cold War, probably the biggest achievement during the Cold War that really won it, quote unquote, for the United States and its allies was by Nixon and Kissinger, whose diplomatic effort was the Sino-Soviet split, to split China, a communist China, from a communist Soviet Union at the time. It worked. It was extremely successful in the short to medium term. Although Kissinger was famous for commenting at the time that in 20 years, we'll have to actually do the opposite and support the Soviet Union against China. It was a few more years than 20, but they're getting to exactly that kind of conversation today, that Russia and China now have the best relationships that the two countries have ever had in their history. And this has gone on now for 2 decades. And, all the people that were, in Western international affairs and geopolitical circles that were always saying, oh, inevitably Russia and China are going to split. China will want Siberia and Russia will recognize the yellow peril and shift to the West and all of this type of talk, downplaying, Sino-Russian condominium. Downplaying. It's often referred to as dragon bear, as the symbols, animalistic symbols of the two countries. But that hasn't happened. In fact, whether we're talking military relations and cooperation in space, the ever increasing economic ties that are reaching some more than $40 billion trade this year, and cultural ties, scientific ties, everything is increasing. And of course, yes, it is a counter reaction to the United States and the larger West's aggression during the last 2 decades of the end of unipolar power. This desperate push to maintain global hegemony and seeing any even regional or great power challengers that are capable of denying access U.S. Military control of an area by the U.S.'s preferred method of warfare, which is, of course, air power and bombing cruise missiles from afar. Any countries that can prevent this in their own countries and their neighborhood is regarded as a big geopolitical strategic threat to the United States. And not only are Russia and China, and to a lesser extent Iran, all capable of that, but together, of course, they are a much bigger threat. And Russia and China are now doing several annual military exercises a year with each other, not just ground troops. They've conducted joint bomber patrols over the Pacific in the direction of U.S. ally Japan. And, the big granddaddy joint naval drills in the South China Sea. And the big granddaddy, I think, of showing the cooperation is they've conducted joint missile defense exercises, which shows a great degree of military and strategic trust, that they do not regard each other anymore in any way as strategic threats against each other. They are preparing in an event of an actual shall we say, nuclear exchange, that they will be defending and responding as well. That's huge.
Yeah, that's huge. I mean, because you can see it, like, just in the way they interact. And on some level, you almost have to behave that way. The bellicosity, I mean, for God's sake, you're screaming that the country is committing genocide while simultaneously being one of the major buyers from items from that country. It doesn't entirely make logical sense. And yet, it's what they scream in the propaganda outlets in the U.S. and Europe, basically, put out. From the standpoint of China, oftentimes, like I've made the point before, that they try to look for win-win relationships. So it makes sense in a kind of pragmatic sense of saying, well, yeah, of course we're going to work with Russia. They're nearby us. They're also being attacked by the U.S. in the way that they're going after them. But I am curious, what is the mindset that is taking place right now between, like, I know the countries are working together, but the U.S. is taking a very bellicose approach in trying to deal with this stuff. By the same token, they're also saying, we're willing to meet with Vladimir Putin. How can you have it both ways? How can you have it in one sense where you're sending Blinken to go to the Ukraine basically to show support by the United States, and then we're backing them, et cetera, we want to put people on the border. By the same token, Biden wants to have a conversation with Putin. What is going on in the thinking here? It seems schizophrenic.
Yeah, one thing you brought up, I was actually really going to go there with that whole win-win thing. It's amazing. During the golden age of globalization, the Clinton years of the 1990s, it was the U.S. preaching that win-win. We can all win together. Globalization, global neoliberal capitalism, win-win-win. We can all win together. And suddenly now it's China saying win-win, and the U.S. saying sanctions, tariffs. You're the demon. China's the demon. Russia's the demon.
The win-win only applies when we're going to win.
Of other countries.
That's the catch.
Yeah, exactly. Now that they're winning, suddenly win-win is out the door, and now we're looking for not only economic decoupling of the U.S. with China, but trying to force all of our allies, Europe, Australia, Japan, South Korea, to do that as well, to economically decouple from China, from Russia, and threatening sanctions against even its own allies, like Germany in the case of Nord Stream, or Turkey or India in the case of buying the S-400 and so on, of even doing business with them, and pressuring Brazil to not buy Russia's Sputnik vaccine and so on. So
isn't that phenomenal?
Is completely up there.
That is astonishing, by the way. They put that in a Health and Human Services report that they pushed Brazil not to buy Sputnik V. I mean, that's astonishing. Brazil has, 300,000 deaths at this point. The number is going up. And it's like you basically got a country to choose to not, meaning American foreign policy interests matters more than the lives of Brazilian citizens. That's astonishing.
it's geopolitical, vaccine warfare. Better dead than red, right? I mean, that's an old Cold War slogan, and now it's just better dead than Russian, because Russia has the same colors as the United States now. It's not just red anymore. But it's really insane. And Putin in the early 2000s, he was viewed as a reformer that was trying to push Russia, closer to the West. He was the first world leader after 9/11 to call then George W. Bush and express sorrow at the tragedy and to offer all kinds of Russian support, which Russia actually did provide in counterterrorism and for the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. Russia was really helping there, not only with supply chains, but with according to many reports that are emerging now, Spetsnaz on the ground and facilitating the alliance with the Afghani Northern Alliance and so on. It's amazing. And it was this series of encroachments into the former Soviet space, flipping governments with color revolutions and meddling and so on to not just have governments in there that were friendly to the U.S. and wanted to join the EU and NATO, but that were actually actively hostile, like rabidly hostile to Russia, and very much doing everything possible to encourage political elites in those countries, to seize power that did have that mindset. And we saw that repeatedly in Ukraine, because there was the earlier Orange Revolution, there was the Rose Revolution in Georgia, there was an attempted Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan, there was of course the dismemberment of Serbia, and the effective NATO occupation and annexation of Kosovo, and so on and so on, and then again this second Maidan, the second putsch in Ukraine, which has corrected from the mistakes from the first Orange Revolution and made sure that all political representation of Eastern Ukraine was purged and crippled in the country to ensure that domestically the geopolitical flipping of Ukraine to the West and the forces that are anti-Russian become the new sole Ukrainian political elite, forming a new anti-Russian Ukrainian national identity.
If Ukraine wanted to get back together, could they do it? Like based on the, if Zelensky said, you know what, I really want to reunify, would he even be able to do such a thing? I mean, does he have the political clout to do it?
Yeah. Full disclosure, my wife is Crimean. We've got family in Crimea today. We've also got extended family all over East Ukraine, Kharkov, Odessa, so Donbass. I'm not entirely without bias here, but I find that very hard. It's long been known in Ukraine for well over a decade now of this huge political and cultural split between what is essentially a anti-Russian West Ukraine and a very pro-Russian, or at least not rabidly anti-Russian, East Ukraine. And the potential for civil war was there. And that was averted by Ukrainian presidents basically playing a balancing game after 1992 and not permanently going either west or east, but kind of keeping Ukraine in a neutral position geopolitically and balancing between the two different versions of Ukrainian national identity, again, on this geopolitical split, East-West, largely. That's a generalization, but, if you take a look at any political or sociological map of Ukraine over the past 2 decades, it's pretty obvious, or 3 decades even, of that split. And by forcing Ukraine to make, as EU Council President back in 2014 called it a civilizational choice, you have made that civil conflict in Ukraine inevitable. And of course, the West was openly supporting the anti-Russian political elites and activists and ultranationalists to seize power in 2014, and they continue to support them today. And of course, Russia supports, the not rabidly anti-Russian political and militia forces in East Ukraine, and even stronger, of course, in Crimea, which actually, voted in a referendum quite overwhelmingly to rejoin Russia after the government that they elected to represent them overwhelmingly to Kiev was overthrown in an unconstitutional and violent putsch in 2014. So the social contract was ripped up. The constitution was in shreds. The president was chased out of the country by Banderite fascist militias, and they said, we want out of Dodge. We don't want to be part of this madhouse anymore.
The voice that you guys are listening to is Mark Sloboda. He's an international relations and security analyst. You can follow Mark on Twitter at MarkSloboda1 and find him on Facebook at facebook.com/Gramsci. Mark, thank you for joining us, man. I always appreciate these conversations. Your insight on this stuff is absolutely on point. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment for the wrap.
Fault Lines. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Peer into the future with Political Misfits on Thursdays when we analyze the latest trends in news, politics, and culture. Catch us on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Achtung, baby.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. And as you know, I've just lied there because Shane is not here. He is actually moving to D.C. So he's moving back into Washington, D.C. So he's going to be here on Monday, and we're both going to be in studio. You guys can give us a call. We're going to be taking calls, 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Now, the interesting part with the show, and just to give a rehash, we started off having a conversation about Liz Cheney and the Republican Party and whether the Republican Party is ever really going to make any changes that makes them, on some level, ingratiate themselves to the public, where they would reach out to the public, as opposed to just trying to change the rules and the laws that would allow them to get in office without doing that reach out. Whether that's taking place in Florida with DeSantis or Georgia or some of the other states, that they are basically changing the electoral law. Well, Donald Trump screamed that he was being cheated. The other states around the world saying, hey, that's not happening, our election was on point. And then some of the Republican states still said, despite it not happening, we still should be transparent. And the fact that the President of the United States was screaming about it means that we should pay attention to it. That's the way that they've been running this, and that's the argument, then the logic they've been using to run with this very specific point. So in the very beginning, we had this conversation basically on what is the Republican Party? And is the Republican Party ever going to get to the point of being like an Eisenhower and changing in order to accommodate what is a changing skew and perspective and want? And I would even go so far as to say need of the American public. Joe Biden went a tick to the left. And that tick to the left screaming that America needs this, screaming that 600,000 people have died, screaming that this is something we need to do in order to compete. That has worked. That has been successful. And on some level, the public has accepted it. Whatever Joe Biden's issues that he may be having with immigration, the Republican Party has not been able to make a cohesive, straightforward argument that has pulled people to their side. Like I said, we're accepting calls, 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. We also had a conversation about a fight that's taken place between Facebook and Signal. Now, the oddity of this one is Signal is constructed and built around this idea of secrecy, of privacy, of whatever conversation you're going to have, that conversation is going to stay private. That's our job. Well, if you think of Facebook, be it WhatsApp or Facebook in and of itself proper, or Instagram, it's the opposite. The goal of Instagram and Facebook is to put information out to the public, and their platform basically uses that information to draw eyes and attention to the public. So you can imagine Signal, being diametrically opposed to this, is running into loggerheads on Facebook. Now, on some level, Signal instigated this. Signal put out an ad in Facebook that basically made the point of saying this is how much they're using your stuff, your information. And they're not telling you about the fact that they're using your information. And it does so by talking about this person is Leo, this person is single, this person is et cetera, giving you the idea on how much information they can get from you without you explicitly telling them it is okay for them to have that data, or for that matter to use that information in their ads and searches and whatnot. That didn't go over well. And apparently, Signal is saying that Facebook blocked their ad on Instagram and locked their account. Now, Facebook is basically saying, well, you broke our rules, you violated our rules. Signal is basically making the point that says they just don't want that information out. Now, whether that was a political stunt or not, it definitely was able to accomplish its objective if it was indeed a political stunt, because you've had a ton of eyes that have been paying attention to this in a way that would not have been paying attention to it if it was in an ad. It's a very interesting story. And look, you may end up having more of these political fights. We had Charlotte Sider discussing this with us and giving us her take on it. She is right here. She's assistant professor at Loyola University Chicago of Law, author of International Cybersecurity and Privacy Law and Practice. And she gave us a very good take in regards to the information associated with these two companies going after each other. And she also delved into the idea of Section 230, this notion of a platform versus a publisher. That's another conversation that we're going to have to get into at some point. We also had the one and only Mark Sloboda. Now, Sloboda lives in Moscow, and so Sloboda can give us this kind of on-the-ground reporting of what the conversation is in country. And, of course, Sloboda, who gives these conversations all the time, Sloboda basically makes the point of saying, look, or basically just explains it, of what's taking place on the ground regarding Ukraine and Russia, the Russian take on this, and what is taking place in the political space in Moscow in regards to the conversation. Brave, ATL, what's going on, Brave?
Hey, what's going on, man? I really enjoyed the show today, man. It was really good. The segment you did concerning our privacies with and the big tech and with our data, I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed that segment. I felt for a long time, I've quoted in the show, I said it before, that we should be receiving paid. We should be receiving some type of
stipend for the money that's being used. I mean, for the information being used.
Right, for our data. Right, because at the end of the day, it is our data, and just even by signing the terms and agreements, that still doesn't release us from the control of our data. It does. I mean, it is fine print. It does give them some room to do what as they may. But I would go so far as to argue that no one without like legal guidance when you're reading those things, you really don't understand what you're reading if you even bother to read it, right? But at the end of the day, a person is still in control of their body, supposedly in a democracy. And so our data belongs to us. And with this constant fight or this constant conversation of how do we mend this gap, the wealth gap between the working class, middle class, and the uber wealthy, and the constant fight of not wanting to tax Wall Street or not wanting to tax the rich, or should we? A very simple means of repairing this would be to tax these tech companies for using our data. Slow them down as well as to how much of our data they choose to use, and in what certain ways. And if they are on the hook for paying us for our data, then that would also, in my opinion, that would also put them on the hook, or one would assume that would put them on the hook for letting us know what they're using our data for and how they're using our data. Kind of like the whole taxation without representation or taxation with representation that old school argument.
30.
I think it would apply there.
Well, I do agree with you that our data is our own. The thing is, I'm not quite sure, like, if they say, well, fine, you need to pay to use Facebook, or fine, you need to pay to use Twitter. Like, that's the catch. And that's the thing where, you know, in the beginning, if they would have did that, say, okay, we'll pay to use our data. But it's like, as it goes on, I don't know, man. I agree with you that relationship definitely need to be sussed out. Because right now, it's, you know, doesn't fly. But look, those end of the week fault lines. You guys, great show. Again, I want to give a shout out to my engineers, my indispensable co-host, Shane Stranahan. And of course, I will see you guys on Monday, and Shane will be back on Monday. Fault lines, Thomas and Stranahan. Have a good weekend, guys. Fault lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Another one is in the record books. Shout out to engineers and everybody else that made the show work. And I want to thank all of you guys for watching and visiting as we put the show on. Look, I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, and I'm going to say subscribe. Thanks, everyone. I'll see you guys. Well, I'll probably see you guys either later today or tomorrow, but definitely we'll see you guys before Monday. Thanks all.